some kind of proposal by which we can, taking into account the various languages that people are speaking, where we will have a home group of 6 people that you will be returning to for feedback, discussion, reflection, processing. And then in order to do experiential work, I suggest we go at times into groups of 3. So we've worked out, Demetrius and I, these codes where everybody is a food and a number. The number is your group of 6. That's easy. If you are A1, then you are in group 1. If you are C3, you are in group 3. But what are the foods for? When we go into groups of 3, the first letter of your food that is allocated to you is the role that you have in this small group of 3, i.e., whether it's A, B, or C. And there is some kind of rotation, and we will take turns in the groups of 3. Somebody will be the client, the breather. Somebody will be in the therapist role, or at least in the role of the other, or what in traditional breath work they call the sitter. And then there is an observer. The third person is an observer. There's a few, because it's not working out exactly in terms of the numbers, there may be a couple of groups depending on who turns up, who doesn't turn up. Some people are not here today, they can only make one day, permutations like that. So there are some groups of 4, then you will have 2 observers. The role of person C, for example, in the first round, will not just be to be the observer, but also to be the timekeeper and the overall facilitator of the exercise. So these groups will rotate. I've worked out 2 rounds in the group of 3, and depending on how we go as a whole group, I will adapt and evolve the tasks. But I will do that depending on how we go as a group. Maybe one thing I'll say about that now, as you will hear me propose later, when we do not just do breathwork techniques by instruction, which is the normal thing. You've all read the leaflet, you understand that most breathwork is based on instructions and on the idea that whoever does the breathing, somebody else come in, that whoever does the breathing is perfectly capable of following the instructions, and that they will do so diligently and consciously and deliberately. As you've understood from the leaflet, that inevitably involves that the person breathing needs to receive the instructions via their mind, and then their mind will have to apply these instructions to their body experience, to their chest, to their breathing cycle. And in most breathwork, the assumption is that all human beings are perfectly capable of receiving the instructions, understanding the instructions, and applying them properly, diligently, and effectively. Yeah? That's the assumption. It's a top-down technique that depends on you following the instructions correctly. As you can hear, I have some doubts and misgivings about human beings being capable of that. And whether even the top-down instruction is even a good idea. It's questionable. But all breathwork, as far as we know it out there, depends upon that. When we think of it more as a relational dynamic or in a relational event, breathing occurs in a relationship, then we cannot be like a dog with a bone. As the therapist, as the breath worker, as the sitter, you can't just be like a dog with a bone giving out instructions. So that leads us to a fundamental crossroads in breathwork, which is you want to be able to give instructions, different instructions according to different techniques. The more techniques, the better. And you want to be able to do that effectively, precisely, accurately, appropriately. You want to be able to give instructions. But at the same time, you want to be able to drop your instructions. You equally want to be available to pay attention at any moment in time. You want to be able to drop your agenda, to drop your instructions, to drop your expertise, and to pay attention to the relational dynamic that is present in the moment, whatever the breathing is, whatever the breathing pattern is. Whether the breathing, we will have to talk about later, I will have to talk about, how do we even assess somebody's breathing pattern? How do you even know that somebody's breathing pattern is healthy, unhealthy, functional, dysfunctional, before you even give an instruction? How do you assess that? However you assess the breathing pattern, whether it's optimal, these are the languages that people are using. Yeah? When people talk about breath work, most people, they use this kind of language, which is medical language. Functional, dysfunctional, optimal, suboptimal, healthy, unhealthy, good, bad. People are nonchalantly using these terms, as if, A, that's a kind of objective assessment, and as if there is some undisputed idea of the ideal breathing, which the poor sucker in front of you is falling short of. And now it's your task to get them to improve their breathing pattern. Yeah. Do you understand that there are some relational complications in that setup? Yeah, okay, some of you are nodding. Okay, good. So what I'm talking about right now is that however you do this, with whatever expertise and all kind of valid perceptions you have of the client's suboptimal dysfunctional breathing pattern, you need to be able to drop that at times and be interested in the breathing pattern as it is. And what kind of relational configuration, what kind of relational dynamic that particular breathing pattern as it is, functional, dysfunctional, good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, you want to be able to be interested in what kind of relational atmosphere that breathing pattern constellates between the two of you. Am I making any sense? Just give me a little nod, because I only have thumbnails in front of me. Okay, Kate is nodding vigorously. All right, that's what we're here for. Good. So we will explore this. What that means over the course of the weekend is that we need to practice giving instructions, having somebody in front of you, noticing, perceiving, assessing their breathing pattern, and giving instructions. At the far end, that means somebody who's really resistant to breathing, somebody who doesn't breathe spontaneously, let's say at the far end, who's really stuck in some kind of minimal, restricted, tight breathing pattern. At the far end, it means you want to know how to push them. Yeah? I mean, in most of traditional breath work, the pushing happens all the time and nobody bats an eyelid about it. It's relationally, I don't know whether you've noticed in your life, a little bit difficult pushing people. Yeah, people don't like to be pushed. They have to be really obedient and compliant in order to agree with being pushed, or they have to be just very, very convinced that how you're pushing them is a good thing. Yeah, they understand that this may be bitter medicine, but they really need to take the medicine. So, you want to experiment with doing it elegantly. How do you push somebody elegantly? At the far end, that means whatever you've diagnosed about their insufficient, dysfunctional, whatever you call it, breathing pattern, you want to hound them. That's a strong word, yeah? But you want to be able to hunt down all the compromises, all the limitations, all the blocks, all the whatever restrictions they are habitually trapped within. And you want to be able to hound those down and hunt those down and be able to propose and push them to do it differently. As I just said, in most breath work, people do that and they are constantly caught in the dilemma between being some nasty pusher, some kind of slave driver on the one hand, but having to do it in a benign way where they say, well, this is really good for you and this is maybe bitter medicine and it's maybe difficult, but keep going, there's a point to it. And in most breathwork, this happens implicitly, unconsciously. It's taken for granted. You want to, in this workshop, you want to learn how to do this explicitly and to be aware of it. And when you're pushing, you know that you're pushing. And then we want to experiment with the opposite, which is that you do not have an agenda, that you just bring awareness, loving awareness and acceptance to the breath and the breathing pattern as it is. And you don't push anything because the universe doesn't need pushing. You know, we're called human beings. All that's needed is being, and nothing needs to be pushed. And you want to be experimenting with that. How can you be present as the breath worker, as the therapist, when you're not pushing anything? So one thing that can help us when we integrate the various wisdoms of psychotherapy into breath work, we can import from Gestalt therapy the idea of the paradoxical principle of change. I'll talk about that later. But the paradoxical principle, the headline is, change happens when we accept what is. When you apply that to the breathing pattern, that means some potential for emergent spontaneity, a spontaneously emergent breath, arises when you accept the breathing pattern as it is. That would be to apply the paradoxical principle of change to the breath and to breath work. Am I making any sense? Hello? Yeah, all right, good. So, over the course of the weekend, we'll be going into groups of 3 where you can experiment with these things. In those groups of 3, Dimitris and I have allocated roles, but of course you can renegotiate them as you see fit, depending on your experience as a breath worker. Somebody may say, well, I don't want to be the therapist or the breath worker, I can let somebody else do it. You can renegotiate that as you see fit. The main thing is, of course, as always, when we do experiential work, is that you want to experiment. It's an experiment. And we'll see what happens. Okay. That's all I want to say for now in terms of the overall program, the overall idea, the overall format. Does anybody have any questions, anything they want to say at this stage before we launch into introductions in a little while? Anything you want to say about, I've read, some people were a bit late with filling in the survey, but I've read most of that. I've tried to make sense with my limited Greek of the Greek responses, but I sort of managed, I think. But if you want to say something to all of us, remember what I said in one of the documents about, in order to make this work, the whole principle of this is that my breathing depends on you, all of you. My breathing is a relational event, and I'm not breathing in isolation. I'm breathing in a relational web. And it is all of you that contribute to me feeling safe enough to breathe deeply and expandedly and in a surrendered way. Yeah? And of course, in breathwork, we sometimes use this instruction. We say, don't breathe, let yourself be breathed. Have you come across this? That's a profound experience when you get the sense that you are being breathed. So this is an idea that we do use in breathwork, but that can include being breathed in a relational web of a group, another person being there. So if we accept interdependence and intersubjectivity, then my capacity to breathe and enjoy my breathing, yeah, that's the main aim. Huh? You want to enjoy your breathing. Huh? My capacity to enjoy my breathing depends on you. And so it's a co-created relational event. So let's be aware that whatever we do, whether you come into the group and at the far end you dominate and take lots of airspace, or whether you hold back, you are contributing to co-creating the emotional atmosphere of this event. And in that way, you affect everybody's capacity to breathe. So holding back is as bad as dominating. All right, good. Well, that's always one of the perennial problems about running anything like this online, any kind of teaching thing, that people go back to school. Huh? Everybody goes back to, I'm now a pupil, and some people are vocal pupils, and some people are quiet pupils, and some people are rebellious pupils, and some people are goody-goodies who, want to please the teacher. And that then really has profound effects on how you breathe. Because back at school, many people didn't have a nice time. This is part of the problem with some of the breath work, that it depends largely on idealization and obedience. The whole idea of somebody giving you instructions, how can you expect it to work unless you're being obedient to the instruction? This is something that, of course, in the origins of therapy in psychoanalysis, people have been thinking about for 70 years. How does, whatever language they use, they might say, how does the therapist's unconscious, how does the therapist's presence as a body-mind, and including their unconscious, how does the therapist's presence subtly and to some extent unconsciously influence and affect and support or inhibit or restrict the client? So there are all kinds of processes, all kinds of messages, especially non-verbal messages, that we give each other through our posture, through our tone of voice, through the way we hold our head, through the way we're frowning or not frowning. There's all these non-verbal messages which human right brains are incredibly adept at reading without even noticing, subliminally. And that really affects whether we feel supported by each other or restricted by each other. And all of that goes on in all kinds of breath work, except that nobody pays attention to it. Because it's not assumed to be a relational dynamic. It's not assumed, it's just the instructor, the teacher, the sitter, the therapist gives the instructions, and then supposedly there is the illusion that the breather is then on their own, and they're doing their thing then, based on obediently following the instructions. I mean, I don't particularly want to pick on people, but you can watch any of the videos, that demonstration videos that are available online. Like, let's pick Wim Hof. There's videos of Wim Hof where he gives the instructions, and then you can see on the picture, you can see the person breathing their head off, and to begin with, and then Wim Hof talks to the camera and gives the explanations, and about 2 minutes down the line, the person isn't actually following the instructions anymore, but Wim Hof is oblivious. He doesn't even notice that the client's body-mind is not quite able to follow those instructions, at least not in a sustained way, but nobody says anything about it. And so it's not really considered to be an ongoing relationship. The thing is just about giving instructions to begin with, And then the breather, and like in approaches like holotropic breathing, many people, they put on a blindfold, and then they're in their own universe, Major Tom floating in a tin can kind of thing. Exactly. You're already saying it. So obviously, in preparing for our adventure over the weekend here, that I made a list of those things. It's not even a very comprehensive list, but yes, obviously, if we understand that the whole point of the breath work, whatever the technique, whether it's more Eastern technique, Western technique, rebirthing, holotropic breathing, Wim Hof, neurodynamic breathing, whatever the technique, the implication is that somebody has decided that the way the person is breathing is limited or restricted and can be improved upon via the instruction. So that means that the whole technique, the whole idea of it, starts with a perception of restrictions, of blocks, of limitations, of insufficient breathing, in terms of speed, volume. There's all these parameters of the breath, whether you leave gaps between the in-breath and the out-breath. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There are so many parameters to the breathing, and there are the obvious ones, but there are also many, many subtle ones. Like, I just talked about how subtle non-verbal communication is between humans, and how our left brain may not notice, but the right brain does notice and responds. So subjectively, I feel different when I don't know. Shall I tell that story? Yes, okay, I'll tell the story. One of the earliest people to really make a big deal out of this is a body psychotherapist called George Downing. And many of you may know him because he wrote a very, very famous book called The Book of Massage. I can't quite remember the exact title, but he wrote it many years ago, in the 80s, something like that. And then he became a psychoanalyst. So he combined all this intricate understanding of the body and how to touch the body and the body process. He combined all of that with then psychoanalysis. And he ended up working in Germany in a clinic for mothers who found it difficult to attach to their babies. Typically, people, the mothers were in the mental health system somehow, and they were on drugs, and they just couldn't attach to their babies. And they had this wonderful clinic, residential clinic, where the mothers could come with their babies and they could just stay there. And the only condition was that they would agree to being videoed with their babies. Now, this is part of their research. So he has got hours and hours of video recordings of mothers and their babies. So I don't know, this is like decades ago. At one of the conferences, he showed a little video of a mother changing her baby's nappy. And when you watch the video, when he shows it to you the first time, you don't notice why at some point the baby starts really screaming. I mean, badly. The baby, from 1 second to the next, the baby starts screaming. Everything's fine. He's being changed, taking the nappy away. And, and most people would just think, oh, the baby, there's all kinds of things going on in the baby. What do I know? No, suddenly the baby starts screaming. And then he shows you the video again in slow motion, including the mother's face. And about half a second before the baby starts screaming, you can see that there is a kind of expression that goes over her face, which is like a look of disgust. She knows she's being video recorded. She's on her best behavior. She's trying to do it nicely. She's trying to be the best mother that she can be. But she can't help having this is like a kind of flash just for a millisecond. This look of disgust goes over her face. And half a second later, the baby starts screaming. That is an example of non-verbal communication, how we affect each other as human beings through facial expression, through tone of voice, through all kinds of non-verbal parameters. That is the effect we have on each other. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, so, usually they have like that's what Freud talked about, all of these meanings of words, but nonverbal communication, they are sort of condensed, over the lifetime. They have acquired many meanings, but yes, there is a habit to this. It's not random. This is what we need to talk about. Later, I'll talk about how every fragment, of experience, every fragment of body-mind perception that you have of the client and their limited whatever breathing pattern, that every fragment has a story in it and therefore has a meaning in the way that you're saying. Exactly, yes. So this is a really important idea to understand and bring to the whatever breath work we do, if we want to work in a relational way, and if we want to understand the breathing pattern as a relational dynamic, then this is a really important principle, what you're saying. Yes, that every fragment, every aspect of the breathing, the non-breathing, the deep breathing, the pushing the breathing, the forced breathing, the held breathing, everything has a meaning. And it has an emotional, relational meaning. Yes, we will talk about that. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you too.
That is precisely why we do not need to keep pushing the breathing. We do not need to be like a dog with a bone, keep breathing, keep breathing. Yeah? We don't have to do that, because every non-breathing, every restriction to the breathing, every interruption to the breathing, every limitation to the breathing has a deep and profound historical, psychological meaning. And that is interesting, and we can be curious about that. So that's why whatever agenda you have in principle about whatever breathing technique you have decided upon, that's why you can let it go at any point, because there is so much meaning in whatever happens already. And you're not trying to get somewhere, or you don't have to be getting somewhere, because there is so much meaning already. And that's, of course, difficult. How do you access that meaning? Because much of that meaning is unconscious. So that's where breathwork then needs to really rely on psychotherapy, because it is mainly through there may be other disciplines, but it is partly through psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that human beings have developed some kind of understanding of how we access the meaning of unconscious or unspoken or subliminal dynamics. But because you trust that there is a meaning, in the yawn, in the looking away, in the whatever, because you trust that there is a meaning, you've taken the first step towards discovering it. But yes, it's complicated. It boils down to, how do you help any human being become aware of what they're unconscious of? And they're unconscious for a reason. They're not just randomly unconscious. They're systematically unconscious, because they're trying to avoid some pain, in simple terms. And so how do you help anybody gain awareness of what they don't want to be aware of, or there is a mechanism that stops them wanting to be aware of it? So that gets complicated. So that's why at those points, when you come to that crossroads in the breathing cycle, you come to that crossroads where you're noticing that the person is not following your instructions, or they're unable, or the body mind is just not cooperating with the instructions, that you just don't keep blindly pushing, but that you think this has a meaning. You think this has a deep emotional, psychological meaning, and you're interested and curious and accepting of that potential meaning, even though you don't quite know what it is. Yes, thank you. Okay, let's take a couple of other questions, and then we go into small groups and do some kind of introductions. Well, it's tricky what I'm saying. I'm saying we want to be able to use all the techniques, integratively. We want to, there is no technique that I don't want to be able to use. I want to use them all. But at the same time, it's confusing, as you say, because I'm also very critical of techniques. So how can I be so deeply appreciative of the powerful effect of the technique and at the same time be critical of the technique? What am I saying? I'm contradicting myself. Yes. There's a famous poem by Walt Whitman where he says, do I contradict myself? Yes, very well. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. Yes, I contradict myself. I'm both deeply appreciative because all the breathing techniques can be really powerful in the way that you say. They can lead to altered states of consciousness. They can change the physiology. They can change the fundamental emotional atmosphere of my internal sense of being. That's why we want to use breathwork, because they can have that powerful effect. And all of them boil down to some kind of technique. Do this, do that, breathe like that, hold the breath like that, count to 4. And, these are techniques. Without the techniques, we would never get the powerful effect. So we want the powerful effect. But when you say that, oh, I don't really think in terms of improving, I just want the effect. Well, why do you want the effect? Like, I don't know, some of you may know Sadhguru. One of his standard things is, if you had any choice about your internal state, would you go for misery or pleasantness? Would you go for bliss or for ordinary? You want to improve. You want to improve your internal state. Given half a chance, you will go for maximum bliss and pleasantness. The thing is that in most breath work, the improvement, the impulse towards improvement, the agenda towards improvement is disavowed because it's a hellhole. They know perfectly well, somewhere in the back of their minds, that pushing somebody to improve is a relational hellhole. So they have to pretend that it's not about improvement. It's just about difference. Or you can feel like this, or you have the choice. You can continue feeling anxious, or you can slow down your breathing. Which would you prefer? I don't have an agenda about it. That's not really true, is it? I was going to use a worse word than that, but that's not really the whole story, is it? People want to improve. How many people you think who come to breathwork seminars are there because they want to improve? So then, as soon as you go to somebody else, I can't help myself. I come to you. I want your help to improve myself. Immediately, you are in a dilemma. Because if you say, yes, Michael, come to me, I will do some breathwork with you to help you improve yourself. Immediately, what is the implication? The implication is that I'm not acceptable the way I am. You see, then you have to agree, whether you like it or not. I have trapped you as the client. I have trapped you in somehow giving me the message that I need to be improved, that I'm not quite good enough or acceptable enough or, fine the way I am. I'm not saying that you believe that, but I'm saying that I, as the client, have trapped you in that implicit message. This is why self-improvement is such a tricky thing for human beings to do. Do you need improving? Are you good enough? Or do you need improving? And most humans are stuck in that, where the reason for change is because they evaluate themselves as deficient, insufficient, not good enough, and they haunt themselves with the idea that I'm not good enough, that I need to improve. So the whole thing is full of that dilemma. And so we're trying to, what I've said so far, and it is confusing, it is actually paradoxical, that's why it's confusing. I'm saying, let's as the facilitator, as the breath worker, as the therapist, let's be big enough to contradict ourselves. Let's be able to join the self-improvement agenda, and at the same time, let's accept exactly what is without any improvement. Let's be able to do both. That's a good foundation. If you can, as the therapist, if you can inhabit a position where you can contradict yourself and say to the client, you want to badly improve yourself because you think you are a miserable git and you don't qualify for, human consumption. You want to improve yourself. Okay, I'll help you improve yourself. If the other person comes and says, I'm fine the way I am. I want to explore my potential, not because I want to improve myself, but I want to explore. I'm up for the adventure. If somebody is completely, very few humans who are, but let's just say it's a thought experiment. Let's just say somebody is completely accepting of themselves and they come for breath work, and then you say, well, I can do breath work. It's just an exploration. We don't have to get anywhere. There's no self-improvement required because you're fine as you are. You're just perfect already. So you want to do justice to that contradiction. That's a good foundation. That's a good relational position to inhabit to begin with. But it's confusing, I agree. Am I making any sense? You see, because they're not coming because they want help out of an inner sense of self-acceptance. Typically, they come because there is pain. And typically, they are judging of themselves. They are non-accepting of themselves. They judge the pain. They turn the pain, the pain is bad enough, but they turn the pain into an internal judgment, into some kind of self-persecution, or at the far end, in the West, we have managed to create a civilization where a good proportion of the population are full of self-hatred. At the far end, it's self-hatred. And many people hate the fact that they're in pain. The pain is, like I said, the pain is bad enough. Why hate it on top of it? Why add insult to injury? But many people are in that condition. So that's what they bring when they come to you for help. It's not that they come to help because I'm such a lovely human being and I'm in pain and now I just want some help. No, they come, they're in pain. They hate the fact that they're in pain. They judge it as, to the point of self-hatred, as some deficiency about them, or some, flaw or fun, like there's a psychoanalytic book called The Basic Fault, which means that people feel there's something fundamentally wrong with them, like kind of original sin. And many people operate like that. And they come to you and they bring that as part of the agenda, why they come to you in the first place. They don't just want help. They want, some kind of absolution and redemption. I'm talking in religious terms. They want to be relieved from their fundamental existential flawedness, which you may not agree with, that they're existentially flawed, but they come on that assumption. And that's the same in breath work, or I don't know, in most helping professions. You have that dilemma, that the way the person comes to you has all kinds of self-hating or self-judging implications that by taking them on, you have already implicitly half agreed with. You already said, by taking them on, it appears to them that you've agreed that they are deficient or flawed or faulty, or that they need to improve, that they're bad, and so they need improvement. Even though you're not agreeing to that. You don't actually think that, but it's just part of the deal. So that dilemma exists in all helping professions. That's not particular to breath work. The question is, how does the discipline engage with that dilemma? How clear and aware and embracing of that initial dilemma are we as a profession or as a discipline? And when we integrate the techniques of breath work with this understanding that comes more from psychotherapy, then arguably I would say we're in a much better position to engage in the dilemma. because we're making it like, this is the first thing I'm talking about. Before I talk about anything else, any technique, anything, I'm talking about how do you relationally situate yourself in that dilemma? Because the whole thing is a dilemma to begin with. Whereas most breathwork is taught as if this is a good idea and just follow the instructions and do this and you will feel better. There is no sense of dilemma that the breathworker inhabits. You could say it the other way around. You could say it more critically. You could say there is a complete and categorical denial that the breathworker has any relational dilemma when they take somebody on. So this is the first thing I'm talking about, and I'm talking about it quite a long time, actually. So we've already spent an hour just on establishing the dilemma. Anyway, all right. Okay, I'm going to respond very, very briefly to two more hands, and then we do introductions. When I was young and innocent, and I started breathwork many, many decades ago, it was easier. It was collectively, it seemed easier. Yes, I agree. So what does that mean? Society is getting more screwed up. People are getting more screwed up. How are they getting more screwed up? They are more and more disconnected from their spontaneous embodied experience. People are more and more getting alienated and distant from moment to moment, ordinary, the joy of life. Why is that? Well, you could say they're overthinking it, but that's just a symptom. You know, that's just the froth on the wave of the ocean. What is the tsunami? The tsunami is an epidemic of misery, a collective epidemic of misery that gets worse from generation to generation. That's what we're dealing with. People are more and more disconnected, and there is more and more self-hatred and alienation. People are dissociated. Why is that? Because somehow we are traumatizing children. We are getting better and better at traumatizing children from early on. And then they come down 20, 30 years, 40 years down the line, they come to breath work, and then they want, you know, a breathwork technique to fix that. It's a little difficult. Yeah, all right. Thank you. Where does this idea of let yourself be breathed, if you track that, where do you think that comes from? That comes from the East. That comes from yoga and Buddhism and, you know, from Taoism. It comes from human traditions that are still profoundly rooted in interdependence, where you're not a separate individual. The Western breathing pattern manifests the Western philosophy, the Western paradigm, which is that you're an individual, I'm an individual, we are separate individuals, and we breathe as separate individuals. So then we need reminding through ancient traditions from the East that that's not actually the case. That's just a delusion. It's just a fantasy. The fact, you know, the idea that you're an individual and that your experience is defined by your skin boundary is a complete fiction. There's nothing true about that. So, but most of us are so locked in this Western fantasy delusion that we need reminding. And breathwork is a very good way of being reminded that no, my identity does not stop at my skin. You know, I'm much more fluid and much more transparent and much more well, interdependent. I'm you know, I'm at the mercy of the universe. And then the question is the universe friendly or is it hostile? And if you're at the mercy of a friendly being, a benign, friendly being, then it's not a problem, is it? You don't mind letting yourself be breathed by a benign entity. But if the whole universe is hostile and out to, then of course it would be madness to let yourself be breathed by that. No, evolution would never keep going if it was, you know, unless the universe wants us to continue, you know, we wouldn't be here. So there must be some kind of benign cooperation that's keeping us alive. It's a really, obviously you understand, it's a really difficult thing what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to integrate the whole psychotherapeutic principles with the breath work as relevant to breath work. I'm not have any idea that or notion that I will be teaching psychotherapy, but I need to make some of the principles applicable to breath work. And that's a really difficult thing to do. But the purpose is to really focus us in a very concentrated way on the dilemmas that immediately arise, and how does that translate into practice. If you are a breath worker, if you want to use breath work in your practice, I'm trying to make it as practically applicable and relevant as possible. Obviously you understand that this could be a half-year course. We could be having, 10 weekends on how to integrate psychotherapy into breathwork. We're not going to do that. So I had to really think very hard, how does to distill the essence of the integration, and what does that mean in practice? So that's what I need to talk about. And then we want to experiment. So then we want to experiment in groups of 3 in rotating. There will be different instructions. I've already said today, later on today, when we start practicing, it's easier to start with pushing the breathing. It's actually more difficult to work with the breathing as it is, because that's more psychotherapy. And for some of the people in this group, that's actually more difficult. So there is a logic to saying, let's experiment with pushing the breathing. But those are the 2 broad headlines. We will experiment with pushing the breathing. Then we experiment with working with the breathing as it is. And then we try to integrate them in the tomorrow afternoon. But yes, in the groups of 3, take turns. I'm expecting that depending on how it flows, that we will do, like later on and tomorrow, we will do some practicing in the group of 6. So then we have 1 person breathing, 1 person being the breathworker therapist, and 4 observers. And then the task of the observers will be to really monitor how the therapist, the facilitator, is applying the principles. And we have stops and starts as usual, where we reflect on what's happening, what's the dynamic. So yeah, some of the experiential work will be in groups of 6, but to begin with, it's easier to start in groups of 3 where we rotate the roles. Yeah. The group is full of lovely people, I can guarantee you that. So it's a benign universe. Say hello to them. Maybe I should spell out at this point that we have some participants in this group who have been working with me, studying with me for quite a long time. So in terms of the psychotherapeutic principles and background, and I've tried to distribute those people fairly across the groups, because when I'll talk theory a little bit later, for many of you, some of it are just pointers. We don't have time. If we want to really get down to breathwork and applying the whole thing to breathwork, we don't have time to go into the finer details, because that could take hours. So I will just make a reference, but some of the people in your group, they will have a substantial depth understanding of what I'm referring to. And so do make use of each other, especially when you're, it doesn't quite apply as much in the Greek groups, a little bit in the Greek groups, because there's also some people who've been in an ongoing group. So make use of these people. Like there will be people in your group that you can ask questions. When I talk about, the internal conflict and habitual mode versus emergency, and what is he talking about? Well, there will be some people in your group that can expand on that and amplify that. So make use of each other when you are processing later. That's one of the wonderful things that, in our attempt to integrate those traditions, some people coming more from the psychotherapeutic background have not hardly done anything with breath work, and they are here, and they can bring that wisdom and understanding. And then we have a good number of breath workers who can bring that kind of accumulated expertise of the practice. It's a sophisticated field of practice, and many, many different powerful things can happen in experimenting with the different techniques. And I think we've got representatives of different breathwork traditions. So yeah, again, everybody make use of that expertise. And of course, the suggestions will be when we do more active work, experiential work in the groups of 6 later, that in every group there should be at least one person who has really significant experience of being a breathwork facilitator. So if nobody else wants to go, then there's always at least, I think, one person who has that expertise. Good. All right. Let's move into groups of 3. I suggest you go into the document there and you copy the whole thing for yourself and put it into some different note or somewhere on your screen so you have it available. And you can see that Dimitris has done the translation. So you copy for yourself either the English or the Greek version. You put that on your screen somewhere so you have it available. And there's no need to read the other instructions. That's for the other people. When you've done that first experience, that first round, which should take about not more than a few minutes, 6 minutes, something like that, then at the end, and this is for the person C, who is the timekeeper and facilitator, to remind the group of, have some minutes after that of just talking through what happened. Just notice what happened. I've set it up so it's an interesting experience. I've thought quite a lot about how to do this. You'll have about, just have a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes to then talk it through what happened from your various positions. So the whole thing will only take 10 minutes. And then we'll have a second round. We don't come back to the whole group in between. You have a round 2. And then person A can go to see round 2 here on screen. You go to round 2. Person A, there's a different instruction. You will be taking a different role. Like Joe was saying a little while ago, will we be rotating roles in those groups? Yes, that was the idea of round 2, that now person A will be the timekeeper facilitator, which was previously done by person C. So we rotate the roles and then read the instructions there, and then that'll take another 10 minutes. So all in all, the whole thing should take you about 20 minutes. And that will, obviously, I've concocted the suggestion, the exercise, because it's to do with what we've already said in abstract, which is that 2 people's presence impacts on each other and affects each other's breathing. And this is an experiential exercise to get inside of that, to demonstrate that. Don't read the instructions for the other people, because especially, there's instructions for the different roles that hopefully will make that an interesting experience, which you will have a little bit of time to process in the small groups. And then we come back and talk about it. And I may then suggest another round, or we may just go into groups of 6 and process it further. There's an instruction for person B, which is something to do with influencing the quality of your presence, taking a particular attitude. It's better if person A doesn't know what that is. Person A, in the first round, person A is the person breathing. And so your instruction is to breathe in whatever you decide is the most beneficial way for you. The point is that when you do the exercise, you have put person B big on the screen. Yeah, like in Zoom, does everybody know how to do that? You go to the person who's your partner in the exercise. In the group of 3, there will only be 3 of you. You take your cursor to their picture, and then in the top right corner of the picture, there's 3 dots. And then you get a drop-down menu, and then you say, add pin. You can make them big, basically. They will take the bulk of the screen. And so that is on Zoom the closest we can get to being in a room with somebody, like sitting with somebody or being with somebody in proximity. That's the closest we get. you make them big. And person B does the same thing with person A, and person C puts both of these people, because you're the observer, you make both of them big. So you will have two big faces on your screen for person C. So just try that out right now. Just pick me or pick anybody. Go to their thumbnail, go to their picture. You can see there it says mute and the three dots. You click on the three dots, and then down, halfway down, you can see add pin, replace pin. So that's what I suggest you use. So that's quite an important part of the exercise, that you really can see the face of the other person rather than a tiny little thumbnail. The exercise is likely to be more profound if you minimize the talking. I think 2 minutes of breathing, like in his small group, Joe was talking about how some imagination in him already before the workshop was going ahead. And the fantasy of that made him feel more anxious, because he understands that this whole adventure is about breathing whilst being looked at. Like, that's why so much of breath work finds ways of minimizing contact, because they understand that being looked at whilst breathing, in a way, you're naked. Yeah. If I'm breathing and you're looking at me and I'm looking at you, the breathing is so revealing in a way. It's as if I'm naked. That's a very vulnerable position. And 2 minutes of being in that position is quite vulnerable making and potentially anxiety provoking, because I'm very likely to project all kinds of judgments into you looking at me. You know, what does she think about my breathing? And my breathing is is me, is my spontaneity. And now I'm not distracting us by talking. So the exercise, as I say, is going to be more powerful if you minimize the talking. And 2 minutes of being looked at while breathing is quite an intense experience, especially when the invitation is to give yourself a nice time. Like, many humans do not know how to do this, how to breathe and give themselves a nice time. This is why somebody, I can't remember, said about, are things getting worse? You know, human beings in the West seem to lose the capacity, the understanding, the embodied wisdom of how to give themselves a nice time by breathing. Many people don't know how to do this. But yes, it's quite a vulnerable making experience. And that is exactly why we start with it. You know, I could have done a different kind of format, and we could go around the houses and we could set it up, and, you know, but then we will never get to the end of this workshop with you having gained much, because we're going right for the vulnerability there, right there. Yeah, that's right. The first instruction for the breather is just to talk about the experience of breath work whilst being looked at. And then there's only 2 minutes of breathing whilst being looked at. So that's only 4 minutes. It doesn't sound like much, but when you do it, it'll be a long time. And you just leave a little gap in between those two. And then after those 5 minutes of person A talking for 2 minutes and then breathing for 2 minutes, you have some time to process, like 4 or 5 minutes just to talk about it. What was that like between the three of you? So that makes 10 minutes. That's round one. And then you switch over to round two and do another version, a slightly morphed version of the same exercise, and with different instructions. You know that in many of these experiential workshops, people do pair work, and then person A goes first, and then person B gets their turn, and they do the same thing. It's a bit boring. Like, if you're a workshop facilitator, don't set up exercises like that. Don't set up pair work, and don't set up just the repeat the second time of the first version, as if you have to be democratic about it. If you want to maximize the learning, you change the exercise a little the second time round. So the second round is a little different. And then again, you've got 4 minutes or 2 minutes talking, 2 minutes breathing, and then 5 minutes processing. So altogether 20 minutes. Does that make sense? So everybody back? let's take a few minutes just to give a few impressions of how that worked. From visiting at mostly the English groups, I think whatever the intention was for that exercise, I think it largely worked. But you tell me, give everybody some impressions of what that was like and what you learned from it and what it demonstrated. And most of us find some kind of oscillation between predominantly paying attention to the outside world versus the inner world. And of course, you can gather from how we are approaching this that there's something very profound in the aim, in the idea, in the possibility that there might be simultaneously a deep connection to the self via the attention in the here and now, like you say, to the breathing, and at the same time, an intense connection with the other person. And most of us cope with the vulnerable making quality of that by focusing on one or the other. You know, I can sit here and I can pretend that I'm looking at you, but I'm actually just staring into space. But really, I'm paying mainly attention, just to give you a quality of that. It would be like that. I'm looking at you, apparently, but I'm not really looking because I'm really I'm more internal. I might as well have my eyes closed. Or the other version would be that I'm really, I've got you as thumbnails right now, but I'll pin somebody for the purpose of the exercise. Okay, I'll pin somebody. And I'm really just paying attention to you. And I'm hardly noticing what goes on in my body. Yeah? So these are the extremes. And something precious, profound can happen when the two come together. And that's, of course, what we mean by the intimate edge. There's an intimate edge inside, and there's an intimate edge interpersonally, and then they come together. Yeah, great. That for most people, this synchronizing of the breath either doesn't happen or it maybe happens subliminally. But if it does happen, or if we do it to some extent deliberately, it becomes possible to make some connection or to create some kind of resonance, even with people when they are quite dissociated. Like, let's say you've got a client, they're in a really traumatized state, they're in some kind of dissociative state. And for many therapists, immediately you feel compelled, you feel agitated, appropriately so in a way, you feel compelled to do something and to counteract the dissociation that you perceive by some kind of activity. And a lot of the time, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there is the other option that you might trust what a couple of people have been saying just now, that by synchronizing the breathing, whatever the breathing, if the person is in a dissociated state, very likely their breathing is not smooth and easy and expansive. But if you synchronize your breathing with theirs, you may find that there is some sense of connectedness from both parties, like a reassuring connectedness. What's one of the main things about trauma and a dissociated state? The person feels isolated. So if you can, to some extent, deliberately synchronize your breathing and establish a connection, even in the isolation and dissociation, then that can have a very containing effect without anybody saying anything. This is a hugely underestimated possibility in trauma work. When people get really panicky about the client drifting outside of the window of tolerance. And so that, like I say, usually generates a lot of activity on the therapist's part, but it doesn't have to if you can rely on this simple, powerful thing that we're just talking about, that we just found in the experience. And so this is such a beautiful illustration of how idiosyncratic the experience of breathing, the experience of the other, the meaning making, the unconscious meaning making that goes on between the two, as you say, via the lens of the object relations, which is why all these ideas about generic principles of what is good breathing, how to do it, how to encourage somebody to breathe, you have no idea, as you're saying, what subjective effect the most benign intention can have on the other person. So this is such a beautiful illustration of how much relational awareness and, in a way, uncertainty we want to bring to this, when really a lot of breath work appears very determined and certain in its directiveness, which, as we will practice, there is a really important quality to being able to give clear and unambiguous and directive instructions. And that needs to be part of our capacity. And at the same time, as I said at the beginning, we want to be able to be really sensitive to the ambiguity and the uncertainty of what this means to the other. Whatever I'm saying, whatever I'm modeling, whatever I'm demonstrating, whatever that means to the other, that's a mysterious animal. And I want to be sensitive to it. And therefore, I need to inhabit some position of uncertainty. And so for most people, that's just mind-boggling. How can I be a determined, clear, instructional authority and at the same time be this person who is uncertain, receptive, sensitive, open, not at all directive or certain? How can we combine all of those contradictory qualities into the same therapeutic position? Yes. But what you're saying illustrates that we need to, it's really necessary. Even if it appears impossible to the mind, it's nevertheless necessary. These are complications and dilemmas that in breathwork nobody thinks about. What do you do with, let's say you have the perception, I was opening my mouth, I was doing that with an intention of being inviting and saying, yes, let's not force anything, but let's kind of expand and enjoy. And that was my encouraging invitation and participation. And then they take it as some kind of, come on now, open your mouth also and follow me and copy me. And, this is how you do it the correct way and you're not doing it the correct way and all of that. So that would have a contracting, inhibiting effect on the other person. And then you notice that. And then you are in a dilemma. What are you going to do? Are you going to go back to the idea that you're just a neutral presence for them that can give instructions, say, well, look, now you're kind of restricting your breathing there, and why don't you? Then you're falling exactly into the trap that's already you're perceiving is set up. On the other hand, if you say, well, what's going on for you? You now need to notice that you can't presume yourself to be received as a benign presence. So like those of you who've worked with me in psychotherapy, you understand that we can capture that dilemma through an apparently very simple, innocuous question, which is, if I were now to ask the question, what's going on for you? Who am I becoming? Or in opening my mouth already, who have I become when I did that? Who have I become for the other in doing that? And that awareness that I may have an intention, but I may not be received as that person with that intention. I may be received as somebody very different who is now investigating or scrutinizing or, having an agenda. And so, yeah, at that point, whenever you make an intervention based on seeing that gap between what your intention was and how it's being received, again, immediately you're pervaded by the dilemma. Are you going to make the intervention in a more authoritative way? Or are you going to make the intervention in a more receptive way, in an uncertain way, in a more intersubjective kind of authentic relating way? The whole thing is full of dilemmas, exactly. And these dilemmas are no different from the dilemmas that we talk about in psychotherapy, except now that maybe everything is a little bit more intensified through the immediacy of the breathing and the nakedness of the breathing person being observed. Yeah. The whole thing is full of the complications of human relationship. If you synchronize too much, you're screwed. If you don't synchronize, you're screwed. On balance, you're screwed. No, because synchronizing is like merging. Not to synchronize is like being completely separate and different. And there needs to be some dance. Sometimes you synchronize, sometimes you're different. Something, you know, and is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? For some people, merging is torture. For some people, being separate and different and separate, like distant, is being distant and cold. So there's no guideline. We just have to work it out. You know, two flawed humans work it out. Now, these are the questions. Look, this, like, I don't know how many, actually, I don't have the overview, how many people in this group are really coming mainly, predominantly from the breathwork tradition. But the precious thing about you speaking like this is just how many questions there are, how many dilemmas there are, how many uncertainties there are, how many things do not get paid attention to in simple breathwork instruction. So we're just establishing this. We're still in the first bit of this weekend. We need to move on now soon, but you're just illustrating exactly the point that I said in the leaflet, and this is what I want. This is what I wanted us to experience. Just how many questions, dilemmas there are. So yes, there's more questions. Yeah, great. The inspiration for the exercise, some of you may know, the first half being impassive, keeping a still face, not responding, depriving yourself of nodding the head and things that you might otherwise naturally do. This is inspired by what in infant research they call the still face experiment. I don't know whether you've seen the videos. They did experiments where they gave mothers and the instruction to be normal with the baby and then turn away and then turn back to the baby and then for a minute just do exactly the exercise, keep a still face and not respond. And is it just about the breathing? No, it's not just about the breathing, as you say, Philip. It's a zillion things how that attitude that you were trying to take, that kind of impassive, somebody called it stoic. I think that's quite a good way of calling it. Like that stoic attitude, how that communicates itself. The breathing is just one tiny little channel of a much wider way that occurs, yes. And as people have said in various ways, it's astonishing when we really pay attention to it, how much that occurs even via the screens. Yeah. And not many people have talked about the difference between the first minute and the second minute. And I'm suspecting that not everybody quite got the exercise, or that sometimes the facilitator didn't announce the first minute. And so the change wasn't that obvious. And, so it's difficult to give the instructions in a way that everybody really is on board. Very few people have talked about the second round, where the instruction for the person breathing was to have an explicit attitudinal reaction against the other person's the receiving, the therapist's attitude. So not many people have talked about that, but I just want to briefly mention that these things would usually, what we did explicitly in the exercise, these things we can assume usually happen unconsciously. In any other walk of life, if I'm a person who badgers you with instructions, you can make an educated guess that they will, consciously or unconsciously, to some extent, they will get stubborn. They will resist, or they will become what in English they call pig-headed. They will, they will react. So it's not a one-sided thing. Whatever instruction you give in the most benign voice and hypnotic kind of induction that you can as a breath worker, an instruction is an instruction, and people react very differently to instructions. But if there's just a stream of instructions, there's very likely that in spite of themselves, the breathing person will find themselves resisting, reacting, getting stubborn, refusing. It's just part of the psyche in reaction to instructions. So the point of the exercise was to make those reactions that people have to each other in ordinary breath work, to make those things explicit, and for us to notice that these things probably go on anyway. And so then for the rest of this weekend, the task becomes, how can we consciously include all of those phenomena? You know, like you're saying, Philip, there is the breathing, but this is part of a much wider phenomenology. And so this is not something that usually people pay attention to in the talking therapies. You know, this is very underrepresented and neglected there also, which is, of course, why many breath workers say they are somewhat superior or contemptuous of psychotherapy, because they assume that all psychotherapy is talking therapy. And then they think, well, nothing much happens in the talking. It's just talking, left brain talking. And so breath work, many people construct breath work as the embodied antidote, the embodied alternative to talking therapy. But of course, we're not talking about that here. We're talking about really weaving the best of both together. And that requires us to pay attention, as Philip was implying, to the whole phenomenology of the two body minds interacting, and all the relational, like the thing that Joe was talking about, the relational fantasies, and how my intention as the therapist can be really misunderstood and misreceived and constructed via the relational universe and the client's inner world in ways that I can't possibly predict, although I may have some non-verbal cues that my intervention isn't quite landing the way I intended it. So this is what some psychotherapists talk about or think about, that what we think of as somebody's character, somebody's personality, you know, this is who I am kind of thing, that this is shaped by hidden trauma. And therefore, when people say, I'm an introvert, well, how did you become an introvert? Maybe when you were 3 years old and you were a little bubbly girl in character and you talked to everybody, and you know, you were the life and soul of the party, maybe you didn't get an affirming, validating response. Maybe to not be celebrated and delighted in, you know, that was to some extent traumatic. You were very expressive as a girl, but now all you remember is that for most of your conscious life and memory, you are an introvert. Well, were you born an introvert, or were you made an introvert by some kind of relational trauma? It's not so clear.
So when being an introvert can be something you can born with, or not?
Maybe. I have no idea.
Okay.
Probably a little bit, but generally speaking, in our culture, people underestimate. You see, this wasn't exactly the point of the exercise. But what we can get from the exercise is how all of us, even though we are working in this field, we're not even representative of the general population. But there's a strong sense of surprise how much we affect each other non-verbally, and how much we are plugged into each other non-verbally. So now imagine being a child. You have the same thing. You have the same sensitivity. You have the same sensitivity to yourself. You have the same sensitivity to other people. You pick up the messages that are being communicated non-verbally, and they really affect you. If somebody is unresponsive, like in the exercise, a little bit cold, a little bit unresponsive, you shrink. You don't feel like breathing. And you think, oh, I'm an introvert. Well, are you? Or are you being made into an introvert because the other person is cold and distant? I'm not saying that we're all born with nothing, that we're all tabula rasa kind of, you know, people, you know, most parents say the child was born with some kind of temperament, with some kind of, you know, the one was different from the other. I could talk about that. It's complicated. So the safest thing to say is, let's not be too certain. Maybe a little bit of nature, maybe a little bit of nurture. What is genetics? People don't know. People hugely underestimate the relational messages that a mother is giving to her fetus in the womb. People don't think about this, but the mother has fantasies about the baby. So she's giving messages. Her blood, her energy is giving messages to the fetus long before the baby's born. So is the baby an introvert at 4 weeks in the womb? Well, maybe the mother is already giving messages. So is it genetic? I have no idea. Let's be uncertain. All right. Let's have a little break. So after the break, I think we got enough from the exercise and its time is moving on. I will do slides. After we come back, I will try and take you through the slides of the basic principles, building on everything we've said so far. I will now try to really make it relevant to how we're going to be experimenting for the rest of the weekend. So it's the main focus, the main purpose, the main aim is to be practical, but there will be some theory involved. All right. If we can all go through the slides on the understanding that in order to do justice to a really diverse group of people, there's a few points I need to cover, but let's agree that I'll zip through the more abstract parts and just touch on them briefly. And if it doesn't make sense and it feels important, then stop me. Otherwise, I'll zip through the more theoretical parts and linger on the parts that are much more relevant to the next practice round. Because I'm in the slides, I'm integrating the two. I'm saying some theoretical general points, largely from, some kind of, there's a bit of philosophy, then there's mainly psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic understandings. Some of them we touched on in terms of, what is character and how does character get shaped early in life. We do need that as a shared understanding when we encounter limitations, interruptions, blocks in the breathing. And we need to, as we said, they have a meaning, and then we need to have some kind of framework for that meaning making. Anybody else want to say anything? We want to maximize the experiential, as Philip is saying, but there's no point unless we really have something to both to observe, but also for those of you taking the role of therapist, we need to, because it's unusual, the integration of paying attention to the breathing and the psychotherapeutic perspective, we need to have some kind of markers for you to pay attention to. All right. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll launch. Yep. All right. Looking at the chat. Share screen. Here are the slides. Okay, this was more or less already in the video, in the leaflet, that we want to integrate all of these various traditions. Is it possible? Well, I was being humble in the leaflet. I've been doing it for 25 years, so I think it should be possible. So when we do breathwork in person, it's a little bit less impossible than we're having it now, yeah? Because right now we don't have a view of the whole body, but the whole body gives signals. There is incredible multitudes of information that come through being in the same room, sitting next to each other. There's all kinds of nonverbal cues that we don't even know we're picking up, but that make our attunement so much more accurate and detailed. And then, of course, when one of the main limitations that we're facing here is when somebody's breathing appears, let's say you're the therapist and the other person's breathing appears restricted to you. How do you do this whole translation process of having a perception, articulating it, putting it to the person, them understanding it, them receiving it, them understanding it as a benign, helpful, intended thing? You know, there's many, many barriers. Whereas if somebody is, you know, like something that, actually, I'll just demonstrate. Put me large on screen. You know, very often what happens is that somebody's breathing, there's more intensity, and they go a bit like that. Imagine they're lying down, but they're going a little bit like this. They're arching the neck, yeah? And how many times can you say, don't arch your neck? Notice your neck. Notice what's happening in your neck. Your head is bending a bit backwards, seems to me. You know, some of you are smiling, I can see. How many ways can you have of saying it? When really, if you were in the room, you'd just say, how would it be if I hold your neck? And then you just sit behind them and you hold their neck. And the information in that touch and in what the information you receive from holding their neck, but more importantly, the information they receive from having their neck felt by you and having your touch reflect back or draw attention to what was going on in the neck in the first place. Why does you saying it to them, saying looks like you're arching your neck a little, does that feel like that? Can you feel that? Is that true for you? You know, you can sort of approach it gently, giving feedback. But one of the problems is that to them, a lot of the time, it feels normal. So you're drawing attention to a habitual restriction in their body around the breath. It might not make that much sense to them because to them it's normal. That is the pattern. That's the habitual nature of the pattern. So there is a real limitation in having to talk about it, when really, ideally, you just take route number one and you touch. And then the whole thing is much more obvious and much more varied in the kind of information that passes back and forth. So we don't have that. So, which is crucial, really. If there are deeper layers of regression that you're going to access, then being in the same room and having the possibility of touch, all kinds of touch, you know, you can have touch just to bring awareness to a part of the body, or you can touch because it's really tight and tense and the person cannot actually feel the neck because the muscles at the back are so tight. Then maybe you press them, you squeeze them, you know. Like there are some bodywork approaches where it's actually quite painful when they touch and massage and, you know, palpate. It can get quite painful. So there's a whole, and then there's touch more as a kind of supportive thing or a holding or a containing thing. There's a million ways of touching. And we don't have that. So we have to, on screen, take the route of verbal articulation, and some of it is really limited when it comes to those more primitive messages and communications and sense of being embodied. Anyway, so that was about the mission impossible that we're engaged in. So now, on the most abstract level, and I am going to zip through this, breathwork helps us notice that we're operating, that there's a lot of mileage in approaching the universe as whatever words you want to throw at it, holistic, psychosomatic, holographic, fractal, parallel process, they're all more or less in the same ballpark. It's the recognition that the different levels of our experience reflect each other, that the body expresses the mind expresses the body expresses the feelings, the psyche manifests in the body. You know, the whole thing is a meaningful whole, and the different levels reflect each other. They carry information about each other. And so once you understand this multidimensional universe framework for psychology, you can read the inner world of the other person via any of these manifestations, any of these channels. And what goes on one level is reflected on another level. And then we just take that understanding and we apply it straight to the breathing pattern. And therefore we can say that the breathing pattern, it manifests the whole life story. It also, you could say, reflects the whole life story. Or you could say it contains the whole life story. But there is this, the whole life story. What do we mean by this? We mean the whole history of somebody's life. And that includes, especially in the next slide, I think, it includes the history of their woundedness, the developmental injuries, the developmental crises, the pain they've suffered, as well as all the mechanisms they have developed and perfected over time to numb the pain, to contain it, to transcend it, to sublimate it, to sidestep it, to counteract it. You know, human beings develop a whole toolbox of mechanisms for dealing with the pain. And some of those mechanisms are, you know, the best we can do. Some of them are creative. Some of them are actually self-sabotaging and destructive in the end. And we do the best that we can. So all of that is, we're assuming, is manifest in the breathing pattern. So if you're a breath worker, therapist working with the breath, you have the person lying there. And the root number one for applying that principle is the whole life story is manifest in this breathing pattern. That also means that every fragment of the breathing cycle, of the breathing pattern, contains the whole story. And how the person then, which is part of the exercise that we just did, all of that becomes more tangible, more manifest when you are making contact. Because what do you gain when you inhabit and enter the whole thing as a relational dynamic that you don't get in normal breath work? You get more levels of parallel process, information from more levels of parallel process, because, as it says in the third point here, external relationships parallel internal relationships, parallel past relationships. So in ordinary language, you would say the way somebody relates to themselves is manifest in how they relate to others. If when Joe says, I was intending to open my mouth to invite and model some kind of letting go, some kind of expansiveness, but the person clearly took it as some kind of instruction. So there was a mix-up between the internal relationship and the external relationship. The person misread Joe's intention through the lens, through the prism of their past experience, somehow feeling that there was somebody on the other end, not Joe, but some other person, who was saying, do it like me, follow my instruction. You're not doing it right. You know, open your mouth, copy me, imitate me, be like me, which was not what Joe was intending. So when you explicitly work with the contact between the two of you, what kind of closeness, distance, connectedness, disconnectedness, what's the quality of the contact? Why is that such a precious addition to traditional breath work? Because of that link with the parallel process, that everything is fractal, that the external relationship reflects the internal relationship, reflects the past. And we can actively work with that rather than implicitly ignore that and be at the mercy of it. Another version of the same principle is this holistic psychosomatic understanding that we get from Wilhelm Reich, who understands the body-mind, especially the adult body-mind, what he calls the psychosomatic manifestations of character. He considers that the frozen landscape of the emotional psychological history. That means everything that's ever happened to you is manifest in the landscape of the body-mind lying there, the matrix of body-mind processes as manifest in the breathing pattern. Okay, so this is the most abstract thing. It's going to get more practical from here on. Anybody have any questions about this abstract stuff? No. All right, I'll move on.
Sorry, Michael.
Claudia, yes, you did. Okay, go on.
So what makes breath work different from than working with the shoulders or the neck? Or, what, since it's just body mind, why the breath?
Well, yeah, okay, two quick things. One thing is, as Philip said, well, the breath is just one instance of the wider psychosomatic body-mind landscape. Yes. What makes the breathing special in relation to the rest of the body process is that it is the bridge between conscious and unconscious, voluntary and involuntary. Most of the time, as you know, we breathe, automatically, but we can bring our attention to it. So that is powerful. Because why are we doing breath work? Because as people have said at the beginning, it is evident that if you can maintain a particular deliberate breathing pattern for some time, it'll change your consciousness. So you are using that part of the body-mind, the breathing part. I'll come to that in a couple of slides. I'm talking about breath as the main intensity regulator. It regulates the intensity of experience, up or down. It makes things more intense, or it numbs things down, or contains things, or balances things. It's the main intensity regulator. And that's why doing any kind of breathing with any degree of discipline or continuity, it will affect your state of mind and the state of the body, the internal state of the body-mind. So is it different, precious, extraordinary? Yes, in terms of the body process, breathing is more crucial, more central, more significant. But on another level, it is just one more manifestation of the whole, what in trauma therapies they call the bottom-up process. You wait, you pay attention to the body, the sensations in the body, the movements in the body, the gestures of the body, the posture of the body, the spontaneous body process. You wait for it to emerge and manifest, and that's what we call it, emergent bottom-up process. And the breathing is a part of that, is connected to that. And that, of course, is a good chunk of what gets neglected traditionally in the talking therapies. So when breath workers say, well, therapy doesn't work, what they usually mean is talking therapy doesn't work. And we have this whole other realm, this whole other universe that we bring to the process, which usually gets neglected. Yes, it does get neglected if you think of the talking therapies. Those of us who are Reichians or have any kind of body-oriented training, it's not quite as true because we've been working with the whole body process for decades. Okay, I'll leave it there. The body-mind as the background landscape in breathwork. So this is an unfolding of that previous point that I said, this kind of Reichian understanding. Wilhelm Reich was a student of Freud. A bit more specific, and we do need this because when there are interruptions in the breathing, we are then working with body-mind fragments of experience, with body-mind blocks, tensions, obstacles, sensations. We are working with fragments of the client's stream of consciousness in terms of their body-mind experience. So we need to we will need to work with that. When we are working with the breathing pattern as it is, then we are working with the body-mind as it is. And so then we need to have some framework for this meaning-making process where every fragment has a story. So this is the first point. Every body-mind fragment contains, it manifests, it represents a whole narrative, a relational narrative or a kind of social narrative. And it leads us into it. Like this is what we mean by bottom-up emergent process. We can follow any body-mind fragment and say, okay, let's pay attention to this. Let's say, just one example, I think I'll mention later, it's like a frown. Just do this. Let's take 15 seconds. You imagine somebody in front of you, anybody, any figure with a frown. When they are frowning, right now let's say they're frowning at you. Do you notice that that immediately sets up a relationship? If you were a screenwriter, you would now could take that as the beginning of a whole movie. They are frowning at you for a reason, or there's a relational dynamic. That dynamic has a story to it. It has a history, a past, and a future. You know, that frowning at you, that wants to go somewhere. You are a character, they are a character. One tiny little frown has a whole narrative to it. Yeah. So this is what it says in the second point. Every frown has a relational story, which can be imagined, explored. What that means specifically to the question about the character and being introvert and all the rest of it, and there's a whole kind of avenue that we could, psychotherapeutic avenue that we could go down. You know, we could do hours and hours talking about how the life story has the woundings of the past, as well as the protection mechanisms against those woundings. All of that is manifest in the habitual breathing pattern. This is what the Reichians call character. They don't mean character like, oh, this person is a strong character. No, they mean character as a kind of armor, as a kind of insulation, as a kind of carapace. Like insects have a kind of, they protect themselves by having a thick kind of protective shield. And Reich means character like that, which means that the breathing pattern manifests defenses, what in psychotherapy they call defenses. The breathing pattern keeps you alive. There is a kind of liveliness, a spontaneity, a kind of nourishing oxygen, metabolism, It's one of the engines of life. But at the same time, the breathing pattern manifests a protection mechanism, which means that the breathing needs to be controlled, limited, restricted, contracted. And so the breathing pattern manifests that clash, that conflict. So in ordinary language, not particularly psychotherapeutic jargon, you could say that the body-mind psyche manifests the conflict between, on the one hand, vulnerability, and on the other hand, protection. Or closer to this idea of character, character is the habitual compromised rigidity. That's how Wilhelm Reich thought, which appears to provide safety. It's apparent safety. Like if I can be in my habitual mode of protecting myself against an unfriendly universe. Yeah. But that is always already in conflict with another impulse, which we can call the emergency, or it's the risk of spontaneity. So those of you who've been working with me in psychotherapy know that I call this habitual mode versus emergency. So I'll just show you the picture for those of you who don't know it. Here's the picture. Hang on, share. Some of you are familiar with this. This is what I was saying earlier helps us understand when the person comes to a threshold in the breathing. Let's say we're pushing the breathing in order to intensify experience. And why do they stop? We just agreed, you're not breathing very much, you're not feeling very much. Well, take deep in breaths, we just agreed that's a good idea, didn't we? Okay, so then breathe. So why do you stop? No, we just agreed it was a good idea. Well, why do they stop? In typical breath work, traditional breath work, these instructions to push the breathing are not understood to be landing in what already is an established battle zone. Most breath workers do not think that they are intervening into or interfering with an established chronic conflict between what I call the habitual mode versus the emergency. And that any instruction that you can possibly give, any instructions you can conceive, lands in that battlefield between the habitual mode and the emergency. And that's a kind of conflicted tension, state of tension. And in the trauma therapies, because we think that this conflict has an origin in some kind of difficult traumatic situation, the trauma therapies have run with that, and they say, well, there is validity to the habitual mode, because unless the person protects themselves, they will experience these extremes of trauma. On the left hand, kind of a frozen, somebody freezing, being so traumatized by the world or by something that happened that they freeze, and at the same time feeling completely overwhelmed by trauma reactions, by the agitation, the fear, the terror, the intensity, the volcanic intensity of feelings. And so we can understand this conflict that the person has in front of you, the habitual mode versus emergency, as the kind of bearable window of tolerance version between these unbearable extremes of frozenness versus overwhelm. So when we talked about understanding that you can give an instruction to the person to breathe in a certain way, and why would there be meaning in them not, their body mind not following those instructions? It's because those instructions hit against, they come up against that always already existing established conflict between the habitual mode and the emergency. And that's where psychotherapists, obviously, who think like that more, have the skills and frameworks for paying attention to the breathing when it gets interrupted, when it gets stopped, when it gets minimized, when it goes contracted, in the way that Joe was talking about. You know, I was anticipating this workshop. I was anticipating being monitored and looked at and scrutinized, and it really made me anxious. And to hell with anybody who wants to push my breathing. You know, I want them to pay attention to how it is. And immediately he's already telling us, he's making transparent that there's a life story right in that kind of anxiety and that kind of anticipation and that restriction. And that's what we want to be able to pay attention to when we say, at any point in time, we want to be able to let go of any kind of breathing agenda, and we want to be able to pay attention and accept and be with how the breathing pattern actually is. Yeah? Does it make sense? Okay, so this is, like I said, I could do lots more of that, but this is the psychotherapeutic understanding that we want to bring to any kind of limitation, restriction, contraction, any kind of inhibited manifestation of the breathing. Because that is the kind of understanding that brings relational curiosity, acceptance, sensitivity, letting things be as they are, accepting things as they are. It brings those quality to it. Without that understanding that the interruption is a meaningful, relational, internal, external experience, you're going to ride roughshod over it, and then you're going to go down the plug hole. Okay. So how do you evaluate a breathing pattern? What is a healthy breath? Yeah, like I was talking earlier with I think Evangelina about, are we trying to improve things? Are we not trying to improve things? How can you accept what is, especially when you're confronted with a really traumatized person and they're miserable and suffering, and of course they want to improve things. And how do we conceptualize what's a good breath, what's a bad breath, what's a healthy breath, what's an unhealthy breath? So people throw all of these kind of diagnostic terms at it. It doesn't really matter how you call it. The whole reason for the breath work is that we realize there are more wholesome ways of breathing versus less wholesome ways of breathing. And the extremes that somebody already mentioned, you know, when they're doing like breathing in yoga, for example, is based on the understanding that there are ways of breathing that are intensifying, energizing, enlivening. So when you're feeling low, depressed, tired, fatigued, shut down, then the logic is that you want or need an energizing breath. And typically, in really simplistic terms, you could say you then need to emphasize the in-breath. You breathe in more deeply, faster, more fully. Whatever you do, if you emphasize the in-breath, you will energize. If your system is willing. Always if your system is willing. This is because it's just a mental idea. You know, like there's a mental idea. Okay, I'm too depressed. I don't like it. I want to improve. I want to feel more lively, more energetic, you know, more confident, whatever. Okay, so then you've got a mental diagnosis, and now you've got a mental agenda. And the mental agenda is I'm going to counteract the depressed state and I'm going to energize. And then, yes, there will be techniques of breathing that will do that for you. But it is based on a mental diagnosis and then a mental top-down instruction of what to do. And a lot of the time, that works just fine, or at least good enough. You know, it works. Otherwise, people wouldn't be doing breath work if it didn't work. It does work like that. It's just not the whole story. Conversely, when people are anxious, traumatized, overwhelmed, freaking out, then there is a whole opposite way of breathing, which is about calming down, which is about containing, which is about grounding, which is about, you breathe out and you relax and you let things be and you don't energize. There's too much energy already. So all of breathing operates in that kind of polarity. Energizing by emphasizing the in-breath, or containing, relaxing, grounding, calming things down by emphasizing the out-breath. And then when you have access to both of those in equal measure, then you can imagine some kind of third position, which is like a balanced state. So you could call that hypo versus hypo, and then a kind of balanced thing in the middle. Or you could expand that and say there's a spectrum. I was going to draw you a little diagram, but I didn't have time. A little kind of spectrum where some people are constantly inflating in a hyper kind of way. They're inflating their breath too much, which is the extreme forced version of having an expansive breath, an energizing, expansive in-breath. When you don't have that, you could say, oh, the breath is compromised, or then you could say it's depressed, and at the far end, it's tight and contracted. So everything's there, you know, that's the pulsation of the breath oscillates between hyper and hypo. And when you have access to both extremes, then maybe a third possibility of a more balanced kind of coherent breathing might become conceivable. So when we talk about the breathing pattern, it's also implicitly understood that the breathing is a cycle, and cycles can be incomplete. There's a whole, or not one whole, there's several whole systems of understanding cycles in the body. And one of them comes from Gestalt therapy, the other comes from biodynamics psychotherapy, where they call it the vasomotoric cycle. Let's give you a little image of how that connects to the breathing. Yeah. This is an ancient handout that I did, like, I don't know, 35 years ago, where about what Gödor Boysen calls the vasomotoric cycle. And it's an emotional, physical, psychosomatic understanding that as we feel emotions, they go through a cycle. Emotional life goes through these cycles. And that is very correlated to the breathing cycle. You know, that you breathe in, there is an impulse to breathe in, to expand, to get more energized, charged. Then there is some kind of expression, some kind of contact with the world. And then there is the other phase, the out-breath phase. There's a discharge, and then there's a kind of melting. Especially, this is how she thinks about it. You can slice the cake into more slices and make it more fine-grained, but that's the overall idea. And that is very, very connected to the breathing cycle. And the idea that at the end of the breathing cycle, at the end of the out-breath, And some of us can experience that, and some others, the system doesn't quite allow it. But there's a kind of melting at the end of the out breath, where you can really, things return to stillness, and there's a kind of melting, and there's a kind of sweet, what Freud called oceanic feeling. There's a kind of dissolving. You could say, if you wanted to, you could say this is ego building, and this is ego dissolving. So the idea of a cycle can be very useful as a background to what we observe about the breathing pattern and the breathing cycle. I'm not going to go into any, you see, I'm rushing through it. I'm not going to go through any detail to that. It's just to give you a hint for further exploration, and we may need to refer to it when we go into practice. So, what is a wise way of responding to any negative pattern? This is a bit more abstract again, like a general abstract question. What do people do when their minds have identified a negative pattern? Whether it's an internal experiential pattern or interpersonal external thing. So there is the first attitude, common sense attitude, is to fight it, to conquer it, to overcome it with intention, will, and discipline. Like an obvious way would be addiction. Yeah? Let's say somebody's addicted to alcohol or any substance. Sooner or later, you will identify, and certainly if you don't, then your environment will, that this is a negative pattern. So now the question is, how the hell do you overcome that? How do you fight that? Well, step number one is you have to go sober. It's not like that Leonard Cohen line, I want to beat the bottle, but I had to do it drunk. Unless you take some kind of step of deliberation and intention and will, it's just going to continue, most likely. So the first reaction is to fight the pattern, to contradict it. Another response, especially when that doesn't work, is to give up on it. That's the other extreme. You resign yourself to it. You let it be. That can be a kind of quite a depressed, unhealthy version, or it might be a more kind of spiritual version of I'll just let it be. I'll surrender. I'll hand myself over to God, and it's a higher power. I can't solve this. That might be a slightly more surrendered version of it. So you could say there is a kind of submitting to the power of the thing, the negative thing, or maybe you surrender to it. So there's different versions, but you basically you don't fight it. You do the opposite. You go under. So obviously I'm spelling out those two extremes because you can immediately see that there's advantages and disadvantages about both of those. So what are we aiming at? Ultimately, also in breathing, we are aiming at some kind of integration, some kind of fluidity. So this is the third option. This is the synthesis. What would be a formulation for that? We bring increasing awareness to both of those, both to counteracting it as well as surrendering to it. So you want to be flexibly responsive rather than a dog with a bone with some kind of dogmatic, this is what we do. And is this relevant to breath work? Yes, it is. Because a lot of the breath work ends up becoming dogmatic, either about energizing and being cathartic, or about calming and down-regulating and dealing with anxiety and trauma and mindfulness and blah, blah, blah. In CBT, for example, they use it like that. I'm not saying these things are wrong. I'm saying whatever policy you take, A, you're not working with the conflict in the client. B, you're becoming a bit like a dog with a bone and giving instructions which don't do justice to the full picture. And they don't help you come to this third position that ultimately is the fluid integration. And so this is ultimately the attitude that we also need to have available. Yeah? So we need to have all three available. So this kind of middle position of, yes, you have to have intention and will, but also you need to be able to surrender. You could imagine that in a way is the breathing cycle. Yeah. So in rebirthing, holotropic breathing, some of the more Western styles of breath work, you contain those two extremes in one breathing cycle. You basically have will and intention and force and discipline on the in-breath, because you really put energy into expanding the in-breath and making it deep. So that's where you can have will. But then on the second half of the cycle, you let go. You just let go. You don't do anything on the out-breath. You don't force the out-breath. You don't push the out-breath. This is typically the instruction. So you can see that in that instruction, there is that wisdom of that third position. So as the breath worker, when you notice that some block arises, now this is the stepping towards application. What stance do you take? Deep down, you notice that the client's breathing pattern is blocked, interrupted. There are certain thresholds. They have been breathing for a while. There is an intensification. Things get more energized, but then they come up against some kind of threshold. In traditional, all kind of various versions of breath work, the instruction basically is just gently reminder, keep breathing. Okay, pay attention to the in-breath again. Go back to breathing. Go back to the instruction. Go back. And sometimes that works. That's good enough. Sometimes nothing more is needed. However, we're then not exploring the meaning of the interruption or the threshold. And the deeper attitude that I want to take is that I cannot force the wholeness of the breathing pattern that I'm going for. Yeah, like it's a profound human skill to intuit what kind of breathing would make the other person feel more whole. Now, how does a human being even do that? How do you perceive or have any ideas about that? What would help? What kind of breathing would help this other person feel more whole? This is going to be the next exercise. Yeah, we're basically going to try, as I said, we're going to keep giving feedback based on the intuition you have about what will make the other person feel more whole. But you do it from a place where you cannot force wholeness. Wholeness, because why not? Because it already is. You don't have to do anything for wholeness because it already exists. It's just you don't quite realize. So what is possible on my own behalf or somebody else's behalf? What is possible is that I can long for wholeness when I recognize its absence, but I accept that I cannot make it happen. I will not be tempted into forcing it. So that's the fundamental attitude that you take as the breath worker when you encounter a limitation. Yeah, does it make sense? Any questions about that? So more practically speaking, and this is now relevant, if in the next experiential piece of work, you end up as the breath worker therapist, how do you give feedback? How do you formulate invitations to the other person? You have a sense of their breathing, and now your task is to help them make the breathing more wholesome for them. How do you do that? What do you pay attention to? And how do you formulate that? The limitations to their breathing that you have noticed, you put them into two categories that you can both give feedback about. The first thing is the charge of the contact between the two of you. And when we were talking earlier, people were saying, I noticed how in the exercise I was oscillating between paying attention to the other versus paying attention to my breathing, my body-mind internal state. It was difficult to get the two together, to both be in the eye contact with the other person as well as really be with the sensations and the process of my breathing and pay attention, be mindful of the breathing cycle. It's difficult to do both. But that's what we're aiming at. And if you're the breath worker or therapist working in a relational way, then you've got these two areas to pay attention to. What we can call the horizontal charge, which is between the two of you, and the vertical charge inside the client. You're paying attention to the horizontal charge, or you could call it the sense of integration, wholeness, coherence between the two of you in the contact, as well as the sense of vertical charge, integration, internal coherence, internal sense of wholeness that appears to be happening, manifested via the breathing. And your task as the therapist will be to make meaningful, helpful interventions that draw attention to that whole spectrum between all aspects of the horizontal charge and all aspects of the vertical charge. That's quite advanced now. Huh? You can see where the closer it gets to practical, this is difficult. So the breathing is intensity regulation. And what I suggested is that in the next exercise, we start with intensifying the breathing, that we make the breathing more hyper, which is traditionally what happens in rebirthing, holotropic breathing. In rebirthing, what's the instruction? The practical instruction is very simple. Breathe deeply and connect the breaths, which means do not leave gaps between the in-breath and the out-breath. Breathe deeply, freely, put effort, will, intention into the in-breath, and then as much as possible, let go on the out-breath and allow the out-breath to be full. And then without a gap, breathe in again, breathe in fully, and without a gap, allow the out-breath. Yeah? That's the instruction. That's the general kind of guideline. That's the ballpark we're in. Your task as the therapist, breath worker, will be to fine-tune that, to fine-tune that to the actual human being in front of you, depending on what kind of internal state they are in and what actual breathing pattern you encounter. So as I said, ultimately, what we're aiming for in the weekend is that you can be, as the breath worker, you can be really fluid between working with it as it is, leaving it be, accepting it as it is, and encouraging intensification. Like there's a deliberateness. Like on some level, you could think at the far end, pushing the breathing is like going to the gym or doing aerobic exercise. At the far end, it's a kind of self-improvement instruction. Do this, be disciplined, breathe in, push the breathing, be deliberate, have intention. So this is one half of the whole picture. You want to be able, as we said earlier, you want to be able to do that. But you want to do that in the context of understanding the conflict. I think that's where I'll leave it. I think there's more. Yeah, it says pushing the breathing versus attending to the habitual breathing pattern as it is. I don't want to talk anymore. Let's just do what we call pushing the breathing. When there is increasing intensity, like say, I breathe in deeply, I do the rebirthing breathing, holotropic breathing, like that, yeah? It's a bit pushed. What typically happens is that if feelings will arise, sensations will arise, intensities within me will arise, I will experience them as within me coming up. It's like a fountain. Like you can think of the intensity like a fountain. You know, you can say my in-breath is an invitation to the fountain. You can call it invitation, you can call it pushing, you can call it, you know, subtle differences in attitude, but there is intention. And the result of it is a kind of vertical wave. And I'll say one more thing about that. Those of you who've worked with me know that this is quite a profound metaphor. Imagine the ocean. Trauma is a high tide. When trauma happens, it's an intense, acute high tide of experience, which is sort of physiologically accurate because you are flooded by what Candace Pert calls information molecules. You're flooded by hormones. You're flooded by adrenaline. You're flooded by, you know, there's literally a biochemical flood that becomes overwhelming, like a tsunami of biochemical activation. And trauma happens when that activated tsunami doesn't find its appropriate outlet. You don't scream, you don't run, you don't, all of that energy that is being prepared as a kind of flight, fight reaction is not being used, is somehow blocked. The cycle is aborted. In the metaphor, you can imagine that this high tide deposits debris at the shore of your experience, somewhere in your system, you know, literally in your connective tissues, and, you know, all of that charge doesn't just evaporate, it's stored somewhere, it's held, it's repressed, it goes out of awareness, and it's sort of sealed. Then you bumble through life from there on in, and there shit happens. And that, whatever got buried there, whatever unfinished trauma gets activated again, gets triggered. Somebody does something, things happen, that gets triggered. That triggering is like another high tide, because all of that biochemical charge is now being activated again, and you are re-experiencing the trauma and you have trauma symptoms. The crucial point in terms of neuroscience that comes out of this, which is a real dilemma for us as anybody in self-development, therapy, whatever, that in order to change an established pattern like character or, you know, contraction or paranoia, or the neuroscientists have told us that in order to change any established negative pattern like that, anxiety, paranoia, difficult thinking, obsessions, addiction, whatever, it needs neuroplasticity. And one of the main conditions in order to generate, to establish neuroplasticity is you have to have a high tide. You have to be activated. It's in emotionally charged situations that change happens. You cannot just think about it and meditate about it and without the activation. You need to be in the embodied experience of the high tide. And breath can do that. If you emphasize the in-breath, it can do that, which is what Kate was saying earlier. You know, we know that when you do release work and when you do breath work, stuff comes up. Trauma that people had forgotten about re-emerges. This is when all of that unfinished, the charge of all of that unfinished cycle gets reactivated. And we're not just doing breath work to feel happy and to feel energized. No, most of us intuitively recognize we're doing breath work because it brings stuff up, but it also helps us to generate the conditions of neuroplasticity that will then transform it so it's actually processed and dealt with. So this is going to be your task. If you're the therapist, your task is to invite, encourage, push, give feedback that pushes the breathing, give instructions that push the breathing, in full recognition of the fact that if the intensification actually works, if the client feels safe enough to feel invited into a more intense experience, both internally and in the contact, that it is well possible that trauma will surface. Some kind of internal trauma state, relational trauma state, that some kind of trauma will surface. It doesn't have to. If the person intensifies their breathing and they look at you and they have a profoundly intimate experience and they feel transported into some kind of altered state of consciousness that they experience as lovely or pleasurable or exciting or deep, that can happen. We're not requiring trauma, but if it does emerge, you want to be sensitive to it. And so then you need to, then you're in the dilemma, are we going to stretch the window of tolerance and push further? Or is the arising intensity and the trauma that comes with it on the back of the wave, are we going to just pay attention to that and process it? Because now we have got it activated and now we've got neuroplasticity to integrate it. But typically, as they say in trauma therapy, you don't leave the person to their own devices. Yeah? When a person is traumatized in trauma therapy, they say one of the features of trauma is that they cannot regulate. The person cannot auto-regulate. They don't self-regulate. They need what they call interactive regulation. That means they need processing with another human being. So that you want to be available for that thing. So there are these two branches of your task: to push the breathing, to invite a kind of intensification of the breathing. You pay attention to how the person's system, whether their ego is willing or not willing or partially willing, it doesn't really matter. You pay attention to the whole system and sees whether the whole system, the whole body-mind comes along for the ride, for the invitation. And you pay attention to the limitations and blocks and you respond to them. You feed back about them. You engage with the blocks and say, okay, keep going. Look, but like how about, I noticed that you're, like I said, arching your neck, or I noticed that the in-breath isn't quite full. How about you expand the in-breath to reach all the way to the shoulder, to the collarbones. You give invitations, instructions like that are oriented towards expanding, energizing, intensification. But when then something does arise, you are available to be with that, to process that. Like if trauma arises, you relate to the trauma. When the trauma arises and there's the intensity and you can feel, the person can feel, you can feel that trauma experience is present, something unbearable, something the person says, this is too much, I feel too much. Like there's too much shaking, for example. Yeah. And then in the first instance, you say, what's the problem with shaking? Shake, that's fine. I'm here, I'm right here with you. Keep breathing, keep shaking. And then they keep breathing a bit. And then the shaking intensifies. And then they say, I've never shook like that, I feel out of control. Then you say, oh, what's the problem being out of control? Be out of control, I'm right here. Let's be out of control. Most of life is out of control. It's just you're experiencing it intensely now. Keep going. And so you're encouraging like that. But at some point you will find that your encouragements, they don't do it, because the person is really in some extraordinarily overwhelmed state, regressed state or something like that. Yeah? There comes a point where you feel, okay, tell me, what's it like? It'll become more differentiated. The block, the fear, the trauma, what does it remind you of? You then get interested in what is the overwhelm. And of course, you're also interested in who is on the other end of the overwhelm. Yeah? Who is the overwhelming character, figure, person that is relationally implicated in the overwhelm. Yeah? But that is the point, there comes a point where you then, by interactively regulating, you effectively down-regulate. You might need to do that. You might want to do that.
Okay. No. Okay, that's clear.
Imagine that when you, let's make up an example. Okay, so the person says, I'm just remembering something from my childhood that I'd completely forgotten for the last 30 years. No, that was a really scary thing. They are back. That's what the breathing can invite. It can invite regressive experience that has been forgotten. So then effectively the person is in a child state. And so then you are effectively, half of you is the frightening person that scared them, and half of you is the mother that is now down regulating, that says, okay, I can see you're really terrified, I can see the fear in your eyes, look at me, I'm here. So, and then if there's, but I'm out of control, I'm out of control. Then if you then say, well, look, nothing frightening is happening right now. This is long time ago. You're just feeling the fear. We're now processing the fear. So, and how do I process it? I don't process it. It's terrifying. So then you say, okay, so emphasize the out breath. Pay attention. Look, you're not quite breathing out. It's fine. So now let the out breath go fully. Let's feel your body on the out breath. You are actually fine. You have survived. Notice you have survived. This was a long time ago. So then you're down regulating and using breathing, using the down breath to down regulate. Yes, we're not blindly pushing. This is exactly the point of the weekend.
Yes.
We understand that pushing the breathing can be a profoundly transformative experience, which is why breathwork exists. If it didn't do that ever for people, it wouldn't even continue to exist out there. Some people, some of the time, have profoundly helpful transformative experiences through pushing. And yes, from the outside, you and I could say, well, that pushing is pretty dogmatic and blind. It's pushing towards some kind of catharsis that's not particularly relationally sensitive. But for some people at their stage in their journey, they find that really helpful. A clock that stands still twice a day shows the right time. Huh? So if you keep pushing 24 people, for 2 people, it'll be the right thing. So we're not trying to not push. We're saying the pushing is a profound thing that can sometimes, I don't know, maybe the proportions are about right, actually. It's about 1/12 of the time, I think, or 1/6 of the time, maybe it's about right. For 6 out of 12 people, and for 2 out of 12 people. Maybe. But what we're trying to bring to it is that when the pushing fulfills its purpose, you then don't leave them on their own the way they experienced the trauma in the first place, if that's what they're experiencing. Where they were left alone. Okay, I'm breathing through it. Then you're a human, and then you engage. You do the comforting, or you actually engage with what was partly the purpose of the whole thing anyway. As I said, don't imagine that the purpose of this is only about provoking trauma. Some people can breathe and they can go into an altered state of consciousness that is deeply pleasurable or ecstatic, and they might feel that you are with them, and that they're experiencing either internally or with you an extraordinary state of connectedness. If that's what happens, thank you. If it doesn't happen and trauma emerges, then we deal with that. But we are fully available for the whole spectrum. We're not dogmatic. We're not dogmatically pushing. We're not dogmatically down-regulating. We don't do dogmatically Western breathing. We don't do dogmatically Eastern breathing. We're not dogmatically relational in terms of, you have to pay attention to me. If you want to disappear inside yourself, that's fine by me. You want to be available for the whole spectrum. Okay, couple more questions, and then it's high time we grasp the nettle.
I understood when you were talking about horizontal breathing, when it's like something emerging, but I didn't understand, sorry, vertical. I did not understand horizontal.
Put me big on screen, Amna.
Yeah.
I'll put you big on screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me, what's your breathing pattern right now?
It's a little fast and shallow.
Can you, Dimitris, I can't see her. Can you help me? I want to see her. No, I don't want to, it's not about me, this thing, you know. I don't need to be in the spotlight. Okay. All right. It's a bit fast and shallow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let it be fast and shallow.
Okay.
You looking at me?
Yeah.
Whilst it's fast and shallow.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see? Whilst it's fast and shallow.
I can feel my heart rate.
You notice how the eyes went away? Like everybody. Yeah. Her eyes went away. Did you notice that? These are the kinds of things you want to catch, yeah?
Uh-huh.
These are the interruptions. This is a horizontal interruption, yeah, in the contact. What does he want me to say? Something like, I'm just speculating. I'm just making up stories now. But my fantasy is there was a thought process with, oh God, now he's putting me on the spot. What does he want me to say? What's the right thing to say? Yeah, maybe something like that. Could be. Yeah. Okay. Were you aware of what that was?
I was just thinking, what's
exactly.
going on?
One of your favorite occupations in life. Yeah, thinking about things. All right, there you go. Okay. What were you thinking? What was the precious mind thinking? Tell me.
Well, you asked me what's going on, so I was just thinking, what's going on for me?
How do you figure out what's going on? Not by thinking. You don't figure out what's going on by thinking. Thinking happens after the event. What do you see? I said, no, I didn't say what's going on. I said, what do you see?
You're looking at me.
I am. You bet your bottom dollar. I am looking at you. You,
It's
Anna,
like you've got
in
this
all your
very
glory.
scrutinizing
Scrutinizing.
look. Like you're just really trying. I don't know.
I'm not scrutinizing.
I understand. It just feels like that.
Exactly. So, to the timeout. So, look, this happens in a million different ways, yeah? This is the fundamental understanding that we get from depth psychotherapy. That people appear to relate to each other. They appear to be interacting with each other, but there are ghosts in between. Yeah. What's the ghost? Everybody can think about this. What's the ghost that's in between me and Amna right now? There's a ghost.
Scrutinizer.
A scrutinizer, absolutely. There is a scrutinizing ghost. It looks like we are two people relating, paying attention to her breathing or her inner world or whatever, but actually there's three of us. There is an uninvited ghost. Yeah? That is nice. What the hell are you doing, Amna? You're not even answering my question. I said, what do you see? You stop thinking. What are you doing? Yeah? That's the ghost. You understand, everybody? Yeah. Okay. Breath work, the way it usually operates, doesn't take into account that there are ghosts. The ghost translates, mistranslates, misrepresents what I am doing, being, asking, suggesting, inviting. The ghost mistranslates things. There is a naivety about assuming that what I say is received the way I intended it, you know, as people were saying earlier. So her breathing pattern, is it, if you remember the exercise from earlier, is it related to me, to her, or the ghost? It's a trick question.
I think to all of them.
Yes, exactly. It's related to all of them. It's a very crowded room. Everybody with me? Okay, so you want to be there. You do not just want to make breathing interventions as if you're the helpful person and the client is the kind of, the kind of poor feeling wreck that doesn't know what to do with herself. No, it's a complicated thing. It's a crowded room with lots of different perceptions, instructions, flying around, judgments, flying around, the past, the present, the future, all mixed up. Yeah? And you want to appreciate that any intervention you make, any breathing instruction you give, falls into that complex field and is being used and heard by everybody. There's a whole crowd of people, and everybody has their own interpretation or gives their own meaning to what I just said. And you could see that, it's finicky and subtle, but, I said, what do you see? And she didn't answer what she sees. She answers something else. So these are the kinds of things you want to pay attention to. You understand the vertical, but you don't understand the horizontal.
Yeah.
What we've just explored is the horizontal charge.
Okay.
And how much you and I can actually connect. And to what extent you're connecting with me, and to what extent you're connecting with the ghost.
Okay.
So if we go more psychotherapeutic at this point, I might say, well, tell me more about the scrutinizer. Tell me more about your, remember, this was the abstract, it sounds abstract, huh? Every fragment of the breathing pattern is somehow part of the life story. The breathing pattern is no coincidence, and where the charge is, where Amna experiences, I feel things, I feel intensity, I have a question, it's both an internal process, how she relates to herself, and it's an external process in how she relates to me, but how she relates to me is mixed up with how she relates to the accumulated experience of the scrutinizer, which is sometimes projected onto other people and sometimes is in her own mind. Yeah? So there is charge in you breathing in front of the scrutinizer. That's an intense, acute, interesting experience. There is also charge in me saying, I'm not the scrutinizer. There is charge in Amna relating to Michael. See, there are different possibilities in the horizontal. There's charge in the relationship with the ghost, and there's charge in the possibility of having a relationship with another human being apart from the ghost. That rarely happens. Do you understand? That rarely happens. So there's charge in that possibility also. Just imagine there are no scrutinizers ever on the planet. I'm not a scrutinizer. So breathe.
That would be nice.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's have that universe for a moment. Okay, so look at me. I'm not a scrutinizer. I'm looking at you, but I'm not scrutinizing. How am I looking?
Gently.
Gently. I think so, yeah. I think gently. Okay. So breathe into having somebody in front of you that is looking gently at you. Breathe into that. If they don't have fruit flies flying into their eyes, sorry. It's the tropics, sorry. No, breathe into having somebody who can look gently at you.
All right.
So keep going and then notice your face, like the internal, what it feels like to be inside your face. Notice, feel the expression of your face. what you notice about your face from the inside as you're breathing. No, don't think. No,
Sorry. It's like there's like I can feel my lips
yes.
like higher. And
Tell me about that. Yeah, what do the lips feel like? What's the sensation of the lips from the inside?
It's like they're kind of smiling, but just relaxed at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And my head is a little lighter. I think before it was having like a little bit of a pull.
Okay.
Like my forehead feels like the pull is gone. Let's say that.
Okay. Okay. All right.
But my heart rate has definitely gone down.
So how long do you want to enjoy being looked at gently?
I'm okay anytime. It's nice.
This is the answer to the question. How long do you want to enjoy being looked at gently?
For a few more seconds.
Okay. You're such a responsible person. All right then.
Yeah.
The correct answer is for the rest of my life, right? There you go. All right. Does that make any sense does that give a little bit of experience to what we're talking about? Any questions about that? Did you? Yeah, go on, Elena. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's not so much of a question. I'm just trying to kind of wrap everything up in my mind. So it's mostly like the thing that I realize that differentiates the psychotherapeutic approach to breath work as opposed to the breath workers approach is the very important premise that we as facilitators, as guides, as sitters, as whatever, need to be really sensitive and attuned, I'd say, at that moment.
Definitely. Yeah.
To the receivers, to the person's vulnerability that arises while they engage into a more intense breathing.
Yes.
Especially an in-breath, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the most important thing for us is to not endanger re-traumatization, I'd say, right? Because as an experience, one's being not in control while they are not really connected to the person who's facilitating the whole thing. To me, it sounds like a full-blown traumatic experience, right?
Potentially, yes. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, keep going.
No, it's just ideas that I've gathered while you were, because for me, all that you're mentioning right now is really important, because my as a trauma therapist that I am, my main focus is not to endanger the re-traumatization of someone's really profound therapeutic experience on one hand.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
And because I've also been trained to work with psychedelics, this is a very special thing that I'm really like safeguarding people that want to go into this experience. And it's more or less like breath work, I'd say. The point where control is control is completely lost, right?
Exactly.
And so this can happen regardless of the whether we are under in any other state of consciousness, regardless whether it's breath work or psychedelics or we're just entering a memory just like that, because I've been through that experience without having gone into any technique. And for me, the most important thing was that I was guided by someone I eventually had to connect and trust.
Absolutely, yeah.
Otherwise, I was entering a whole loop of sensations that were unbearable for me. So the way I see it, this is the most important thing of pushing versus allowing and down-regulating. To be sensitive towards the incident of someone going completely out of control.
Yes.
Which is actually where the magic happens, after all.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
As you are implying, and let's just spell it out, the danger of, you see, people are disenchanted with the talking therapies, quite rightly so. So they look for some other silver bullet. So they use psychedelics, breathwork, anything that intensifies experience, because ordinary talking is just too habitually limited and going around the broken record in circles. So people look for something that will be more powerful, that will have a more powerful impact. So psychedelics, breathwork, whatever. They want the powerful impact, and then they turn it into a technique, and then they think they can make it safe, they can make the technique safe, without understanding that anything powerful is also powerfully relationally. That you cannot have a powerful experience without powerful transference, as they call it in therapy. So the people who are dangerous in using powerful techniques are people who think they can do the technique outside the transference. You can't legislate for whether the other person has transference or not. Like, I cannot legislate, Amna cannot legislate for whether she sees a scrutinizing ghost. That's just part of the territory. So what is the least dangerous way of having a powerful technique? The least dangerous way, because it's dangerous. If you have nitroglycerin, it's going to be dangerous. If you have dynamite, it's going to be dangerous. Psychedelics, breathwork is dynamite. So what's the least dangerous way of using it? The least dangerous way of using it is to be aware of the transference. It's to be aware of the likelihood of enactment. So when I play with the fact that I'm scrutinizing, I'm not. It's a bit like playing peekaboo. Yeah? You remember that game when they play with babies, peekaboo? You play with terrifying the child. Yeah? You're going to go, boo. That's a profoundly developmental experience for a child, because they learn how to regulate the scary parent and the playful parent and the loving parent. And you see, I did something like that with Amna. I actually intensified the scrutinizer. Most people who do breath work, and even many therapists, even many trauma therapists, they don't do that. Why? Because they are paranoid about re-traumatizing the poor client. But what they think is safety is the opposite. The way I make it safe, the way I try to cope with the potential for re-traumatization, is by being aware of how likely it is, and by actively playing with the scrutinizer rather than pretending that I'm all holy and lovely and wonderful and benign. So the whole thing, for those, obviously those of you who have been with me, you understand that I think about this whole thing as very paradoxical, that it is the therapist's capacity to really inhabit the traumatizing object that paradoxically makes it more transformative and safe. And the same thing applies to breathwork. Okay. Does that make sense? Now it's heavy going, huh? We just accelerated from pure theory to, oops, now we're going down, yeah. Claudia.
I don't know if you can say something about the danger from the ghost in the therapist, not just in terms of breathing. Because in your
You're not supposed to have any. You're supposed to have proper therapy so you don't have any ghosts anymore.
But for example, in your in the experiment that you just showed us, I mean, one might, obviously you balance, you're an experienced therapist, but in other situation you could have used your ghosts to overpower or to be unethical, you know, with the client, and that would also be your attention to your breathing and how you work and play.
Oh.
So I was just wondering if you would say something about that.
So when I was playing the scrutinizer, do you think I was free of ghosts, or what was I doing with my ghosts? You're asking about my ghosts, yeah, the ghosts of my life story and transgenerational trauma and all the rest of it, of which there are plenty. So what were my ghosts doing when I was playing the scrutinizer, you think? How do you know when too much is too much? Because for the ego, everything's too much. Yeah, for the defensive ego, you can't say boo to a goose. You know, ideally, you know, like most clients, they want a powerful therapy that works very quickly, that isn't very expensive. And ideally, they want it to work. They want to transform you know, they want the whole life story transformed, preferably under anesthesia, you know, preferably with nobody feeling anything, especially not any pain. So most clients want that kind of therapy. Just do your magic wand. I don't want to feel anything. I don't want to know anything. I just want to feel different. Just do your magic, and you know, I don't really want to participate in the process. So yeah, somewhere that's the magical thinking that people want, and that's inevitably part and parcel of whatever you offer. If you say you offer breath work, then people want magical breath work. If you do psychedelics, then they want magical psychedelics. If you use, I don't know, CBT, they want magical CBT. You know, that magical longing is always part of the deal. And that is partly what makes it unsafe. Because people's idea of what you're going to be doing to them, with them, has this kind of deep pain and fear and avoidance and denial in it. So that's why you cannot really legislate. And that's why we better approach the whole thing as deeply dangerous. The safest thing, the safest therapist, the therapists that I recommend or make recommendations to are those that are most aware of how dangerous the whole procedure is. When you get into a group of 6, one person volunteers to be the breather. Next step is that the breather picks a therapist or breathworker or facilitator or whatever you call them. They pick the person they want to work with them. Other 4 people have different observational tasks. One observational task I suggest is you watch the vertical charge. You watch the client's body-mind in terms of the high tide and how the high tide is being kept at bay. What are the mechanisms that keep the high tide at bay? The high tide could be a high tide of pleasure, bliss, ecstasy, enjoyment, intimacy, contact, wonderful aliveness. There could be the high tide of that. Yeah? Or it could be the high tide of some difficult experience, some trauma. It could be the high tide of that. You want to be equally available, but as the observer, you pay attention to the manifestations of the flood, the tsunami, the whatever the quality of that is. And specifically, you want to pay attention to what are the mechanisms, the habitual mechanisms, the specific mechanisms, the behaviors, the ways of thinking. What are all the body-mind mechanisms that keep the high tide at bay? But most specifically, the breathing. What is it about the breathing pattern, the way of breathing, all the features of the breathing. Before we go into it, I'll give you a quick list that you can have on your screen, like all the variables and parameters of breathing that affect whether the breathing actually ends up energizing or not. So I'll give you that list that you can pay attention to. So this is about one observer pays attention to the vertical breathing intensity, the vertical charge. The other observer pays attention to the horizontal charge, which means the contact between the two people, which is why it's important that you put those two people up on screen the way we just did, the way Dimitris just did for me and Amna, so that really you can only see those two people as from the observer position. And the rest doesn't matter. You just need to see these two faces mainly and how they respond to each other. And as I demonstrated, these little gestures, facial movements, the way they're looking, not looking, where the eyes go, you want to observe all of those manifestations of contact or lack of contact or avoidance of contact or avoidance of the intensity of contact. Am I making sense? Yeah. Okay, that's the second observer. The third observer, I suggest, pays attention to the therapist, like what in therapy we call the countertransference, the embodied countertransference. Notice what happens in the therapist, for the therapist, in the therapist's body, mind, and their intensity. That might be needed. That observations, that task, those observations may be very helpful later. So one observer takes that task. The fourth observer has the task of making some kind of graph about how the overall intensity, horizontal, vertical, the combination of it, make some kind of graph and keep track so that later you can answer the question, what were the turning points in the process? What were the turning points in the relationship? If the whole thing lasts 10, 15 minutes, what were the significant turning points where the intensity increased or decreased? What made the difference? What was it that the client said? What was it that the therapist said or did? Or, what were the nonverbal messages? What do you think? And keep a memory, keep a kind of history, keep an account of what were the significant turning points and what made the difference. What do you think made the difference in how the process flowed or got directed? So those are the tasks for the observers. The task for the client is just to be a client, and you want the best service possible for yourself and for your process. Now the most difficult thing. The most difficult thing is the therapist. What the hell do you do? Because this is the first thing that we're doing. It probably makes sense if somebody with experience. But it depends. Because I said it's the client's choice, so let the client choose. I said I promised we would talk about the different parameters of breathing. Do you remember? I'll put that on screen. This may not even be all of them. This is just a brainstorm that I did. And at some point you can help me make this more comprehensive if there are things missing. What are all the features, parameters, aspects of breathing? Obviously, how fast and how slow. The gaps between the breaths. As I mentioned earlier, the rebirthing instruction is basically to take connected breaths. That means no gaps between in-breath and out-breath and out-breath and in-breath. Then there is the emphasis of in-breath versus out-breath. And I already said, generally speaking, there may be exceptions and complications, but generally speaking, emphasizing the in-breath. That means making the in-breath expansive, fast, deep, strong. Emphasizing the in-breath, expanding the in-breath will generally lead to overall intensification and energizing of the body-mind. Emphasizing the out-breath, making the out-breath longer, emphasizing, like letting the out-breath be gentle and calm and letting go into the out-breath is generally calms things down, makes things more coherent, and generally speaking, contains things. It also helps with, generally speaking, with feeling the effect, the energizing effect of the in-breath more intimately. Like you can imagine that the in-breath is pumping things up, and then the out-breath is not doing anything, you're letting go, but then you have space for actually feeling the sensation. The out-breath leaves, and as you're not doing anything, the out-breath is going out, but then there is a space to actually feel the sensation that it has that the energy has generated in the body-mind. What when I showed you the vasomotoric cycle, what they call the melting. One of the benefits of the out-breath it's not exactly that on the in-breath you can't feel your body. You can feel your nostrils, you can feel the chest expanding, you can feel the muscles between the ribs, you can feel maybe your diaphragm. You can feel sensations on the in-breath. But to let go into the sensation is more a feature of the out-breath. When you are, I'll say this in between, I'm going to go through the rest of the list in a minute. But for the therapist and for all of us to watch, the key task of the exercise is to help the client modify their breath so as to energize and intensify. So that means with each parameter, you can ask yourself, do I have an intuition what to recommend? Like, what adaptation to the breathing, the way they're currently breathing, would give them a more intense experience, a more energized experience? And you can ask that with every parameter. Should they make the breathing faster? Should they make the in-breath faster? Should they have the gap or not have a gap? Should they emphasize the in-breath or the out-breath? Or are they pushing the in-breath too much or not enough? Are they foreclosing the out-breath? Are they shortening the out-breath? Are they pushing the out-breath too much? Yeah? So with all of those parameters, you can ask, what would have an overall more energizing effect if they did it? And then I'll talk later about, after I go through the parameters, I'll repeat what I said about the underlying attitude with which you push as the therapist from the therapeutic position. Okay, then there's the length and depth and the smoothness of the breath, both in terms of in-breath and out-breath. You could have more kind of staccato kind of breathing, which would typically feel like a bit more disorganized, whereas a smooth breath would be more creating a kind of sense of coherence. When people are traumatized, they usually hyperventilate, and overall the breath is quite staccato. It doesn't flow. It's not smooth. It's kind of jagged. Then you can wonder about, is it voluntary, or to what extent is it voluntary and involuntary, which is a fine balance. Yes, we're saying be voluntary about it, be deliberate about it, do these things. But of course, the overall breathing cycle still has lots of spontaneous, involuntary kind of qualities, whether your diaphragm expands or not, or there's habits there that are involuntary. Then you can wonder, where in the body does it manifest? In the throat, in the chest, in the belly, how is the wave? Like a really third position, not particularly energizing, not particularly calming breath, would be really more like a wave running to the shore. When you see babies breathe, it's like a wave kind of running to the shore and flowing through the whole body. And you can see then what parts of that wave, in what parts of the body does the breath flow most readily, or in what parts is it restricted? Then there's the whole question of nose versus mouth. And then the overall sort of summary question is, to what extent is the client in habitual territory, in kind of comfortable, ordinary, this is how they breathe most of the time anyway, and to what extent has the exercise already modified their habitual experience, and they're in somewhat uncharted territory, unfamiliar territory. Yeah. So these, I'm sure there's other parameters that I didn't quite include, but these are the ones that you can be paying attention to. And for the therapist, your main task is to give them time. You know, you don't want to be like a slave driver, but overall, your task is to trust your intuition, which aspects of the breathing pattern have a kind of dampening, limiting, restricting effect. And if the whole system, if the whole person was really on board with experimenting with being energized, then which parts of their breathing pattern, breathing cycle are not collaborating with that? Like how could we modify, adapt the breathing deliberately in order to have a more energizing effect? That's your main task. And so as I repeat the attitude is that you are all too aware that you cannot do this without becoming a ghost. You know that you are being a ghost. You don't know which one, but you're going to get mixed up with a ghost or several. And to do it anyway, because you're paying attention to it. You're not doing some kind of oblivious type of breathwork instruction that is unaware of you becoming a ghost. You're giving the instruction fully aware that there's a good chance you're going to get mixed up with a ghost. And then you can be interested in the ghost, like Amna and I were. Yeah? And you can play with the ghost. One example would be, how long do you want to be looked at gently? No, it's a trick question. Because anybody in their right mind would say, for the rest of my life, obviously. That is playing with the ghost, or the absence of the ghost. And you remember what I said when I was with Amna? There is the possibility that there can be a lot of intense horizontal contact between her and the ghost, or me representing the ghost, but there can also be a lot of horizontal contact and engagement through the recognition that for once I'm not the ghost. Yeah? Because most of the time the ghost gets mixed up with all the relationships. And it's actually very curious and interesting what might happen if there's no ghost. Yeah? That's as interesting in a way. So as the therapist, you need to decide these things. You can play with these things. You don't have to get stuck in one or the other, but you want to be aware that these are the options. There's a whole playing field there, and you can allow the ghost, you can explore the ghost, the presence of the ghost, the breathing in relation to the ghost. You can be the ghost, and you can say, I'm not the ghost. The whole playing field is open to you. And the question is, what attitude will you take in recognition of all of this that has the most energizing effect on the client's breathing pattern? And everything from here on in is your creativity and genius, okay? That's as much instructions as I want to give. And it's over to you. All right. We want the client to really have a legitimate, proper breathing experience within half an hour. So the priority is the client's experience. The learning is secondary. But you may want to take time out. So we need to find a structure for this. So there may be, when as the therapist, you really don't know what to do, you take a time out, say, just hold it there for a minute. I'm going to talk to the observers, and I'm going to make use of all the observations that the observers have been making, and I'm going to try and let that help me. And I'll come back in a few minutes, and then we continue. But I need some support here because I'm doing a really difficult job, and I need some input. You want to have that option available as a therapist. And ideally, if we're doing this in a large group in person, you would then say, hi, Michael, come over here. And then I would just jump. I don't know how we do this on Zoom, but basically I want to be available for when you get into a pickle. So see whether you can find me and like send me a direct message or something. Come to group XYZ, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's it. We don't want to eat more into the time that you have. So let's have the breakout rooms. Where are the therapists? Wasn't that difficult? Yes. Yeah, it was difficult.
Και για τους παρατηρητές θα συμπληρώσω.
My interpretations got lost again. Hang on, I just need to recover English. Okay, there we go. What did she say, Mana?
I said also for the facilitating.
Yes, okay, yeah.
The reverse, it goes
yes,
also.
because it's torturous, huh? The whole of breathwork is in a way to liberate the person into more expansiveness, aliveness, spontaneity. But if you do that, pretending that you're not starting with a conflict, you know, you can see how difficult it would be if everybody understood to begin with, we're starting in a conflict. The whole idea of breathwork arises because the breath is not naturally, spontaneously flowing already. So now we need to do something because there's a conflict about it. So, but once you pay attention to the conflict, it gets really difficult. It gets relationally difficult, and it gets difficult in terms of body-mind process. How do you really relate to the other person's breathing pattern, whatever it's doing, compromised, expansive, you know, on the spectrum? How do you relate to it? And how do you be precise about it? And then all the relational complications of the ghosts and who do you become, and, you know, it's complicated. And you can feel, probably, I hope, it's full of potential. Could you feel that? I mean, could you feel the potential of bringing that depth of awareness and contact and attention to the breathing together with the relational awareness? Like, this is maybe more for the observers. Could you feel the potential? Maybe some of you could speak to that. Yeah. Whether you intend it or not as the therapist or as the facilitator, the idea of breathing deeply immediately constellates fears of regression. That people assume it's meant to be dramatic. You know, because they imagine it, you know, they want it to be powerful, you want it to be powerful, everybody wants it to be powerful, so it must be some dramatic thing. But the whole point of the weekend is that the power that we imagine is not just located in the breath or in the body-mind, because we have these two axes of power, which is the vertical, the intrapsychic, and the horizontal. And the most powerful thing is the combination. It's not one or the other. But because people don't think of it like that, then most of the fantasy, how bad people badly want the dramatic power of it, but of course then they're also terrified and they contract against it. Most of that gets located somehow in the body process. You know, I'll be out of control, what will happen, it'll be overwhelming or something. So they imagine some kind of internal tsunami because people precisely do not understand the power of the vertical and the horizontal interweaving, and the power is in there, in the relational experience of it, which doesn't have to be outwardly dramatic at all, which is, I think, what you are saying happened more at the end there. Really, I take it as an expression of the fact that the therapist's job is really profoundly difficult and full of dilemmas. Yeah. As I said very early on, I said it, you know, I said it right there, but to do it is full of conflict for most therapists, which is that you need to be able to be authoritatively directive. And you are then risking being imposing and becoming some kind of imposing, insensitive, controlling authority. And most therapists habitually find that very, very difficult to include that, even though that is the idea of the exercise for now, not because this is the way we do it. No, this is an experiment for training purposes. You know, try and do it and see what happens. But you can take it as an expression of the fact that for most therapists is actually a very difficult thing to do. And that's a wise thing. you could say, well, my therapist didn't do the exercise. You know, she sort of heard the instructions. The instructions weren't very specific, and she didn't do it. So I didn't get the benefit of the exercise because she didn't do it. Yeah, but she didn't do it for good reasons. And so the purpose of the exercise, you could imagine, is not just to do it. The purpose of the exercise is to understand the therapist's dilemma in doing it properly. Or, you see, it's partly I left it vague, partly we didn't have enough time, but partly I left it vague for each therapist to interpret it according to their own understanding. And what that then reveals is that the task is actually profoundly difficult. And that brings out the profound conflictedness and ambivalence that anybody who's relationally aware should have in doing breathwork. Yeah. It's astonishing. The fact that most of breathwork is gloriously oblivious of this is in a way testament to the fact that if you start paying attention relationally, then it gets very complicated, to the point of almost becoming impossible. I need you all to have that experience. Before I can properly teach you how to do it, I need you to have the experience of how complicated it is. That's why most breathwork is just completely excluding the relational, because if you allow it in just a little bit, it really complicates it. And that needs to be established. That needs to be understood. We need to have compassion and sympathy for the problem, the dilemma of the therapist. It's an incredibly difficult thing. Partly because what Kate and I were just talking about, because the whole thing is so full of the contradiction between people wanting, you know, I'm so trapped in my life, in my pattern, I need some big outside person to do something really dramatic in order to make a fundamental difference to how trapped I feel. But if there was a person like that, I would be terrified of them, because I would be a tiny person, they would be a very powerful magician, and they would basically, they can play with me whatever which way they want. And I'm just at the mercy of it. And then that puts you immediately into a regressive position where you are small and this person is very, very big, which is like what a child feels with a parent. So the transference is intense. So if we pay attention to this whole thing from the beginning, we might never even get started because it's so difficult. So if at the end of this first day you think, oh, blow me, this is really fucking impossible. That's the learning of the first day, okay? That's a good starting point. We appreciate the difficulty we're actually dealing with. So then now we want to work on that understanding. That tells you that working deeply in a way that potentially invites regression or equally transcendence, most people are very afraid of. And most therapists are very afraid of taking an authoritative position, guiding, directing, instructing position, unless the whole relational thing is completely dissociated and forgotten about. Then I can do it, you know, because I'm not being a therapist, I'm not paying attention to you much, and I'm not paying attention to the relationship. So then I can just be a teacher, I can give you instruction, I can give you instructions the way I received instructions, and you just do this thing, and you know, I can completely forget about the relational complications, and then I can do it. But as soon as I pay attention, oh, there is a relational complication, and then Coralia ends up feeling like she didn't actually even do the exercise. So let's have appreciation for that. Thank you, everybody. Ultimately, I am not following a protocol. If I could write a set of instructions, do this, do that, then the whole thing would be much easier. But what you may remember from that mini session with Amna is that I kept moving between attention to the breath, attention to the ghost, attention to the relationship, attention to being the ghost, getting mixed up with the ghost, attention to not being the ghost, being different from the ghost, being outside of the ghost, paying attention to little nonverbal cues, paying attention to the relationship. So that fluidity, if I demonstrate that tomorrow, what I'm saying is that that fluidity is necessary in the therapist to get somewhere. But that fluidity, when you observe it, also means like it's hard to translate into a protocol, or what are the principles? What's he doing there? Because I can't hardly follow. You know, like he switches like that and that and that, and he does all these things that he's sort of theoretically announced. But then how does it all hang together, and how does he string it together from one thing to the next? Because there is no, it's so contradictory and quick that the client is switching and I'm following the switching between the different, like say, channels of experience or in the stream of consciousness. We need to pay attention to that. So I'm thinking, how do we do this? Probably best if I do a demonstration, but occasionally I take breaks. I take my own timeouts and say, okay, now what just happened in the last couple of minutes? You know, what did I do? What did the client do? What happened between us? What happened with the breath? So we probably, which is not going to be easy either, because that'll interrupt the session all the time. And so it's going to be more difficult to have a kind of flow. But yes, for learning purposes, we need to somehow do justice to all of these things. But yeah, I think that's probably the most immediate way of maximizing the learning. Yeah, I agree. It's a really important thing to understand. And I hinted at it briefly in the morning when I talked about parallel process. This is really important to understand in therapy, in breathwork, in life generally, in all kinds of groups. The internal conflict in one person gets manifested by the other person or by the group. One person's internal conflict becomes a group conflict on all kinds of levels. Now, the roots of the conflict are deep and emotional and painful. The manifestations of the conflict, when it jumps into the group, it jumps from inside the person to another person, and into the group. And then the group represents the totality of the conflict. Just imagine the internal conflict in one person, the client, let's say, is like a mirror. And then the mirror breaks. It's not a whole mirror. It's a mirror that's broken into different pieces. These different pieces go into the different people in the group. And then you think that we're not doing the exercise. That's not what he said. We're not even getting started. We're just, like bickering about one thing or the other. It's all irrelevant. It's so, let's do it. That's because everybody carries one of the broken pieces of the mirror. And yes, you can get frustrated with it, and that's understandable and it's fine, valid. But what you are also implying is some intuition that it's not just a waste of time, because there is a rhyme or reason in how these pieces of the mirror get manifested in a group. And once you understand that principle, you're then in a good position to facilitate, because you know that nothing much can ultimately happen unless you and others together can bring these pieces together again. And not just on some abstract level about how do we do the exercise and what's right and what's wrong. I mean, that's just froth. That's just superficial. No, these are reflections of the deep conflict and the fact that the pain is being avoided. There is really something unbearable that's going on. It's not obvious on the superficial level that there is really deep pain going on or avoidance of deep pain, but you want to keep in mind that this kind of fragmentation of the mirror and the way it gets manifested in other people, it wouldn't happen unless there was really a deep and meaningful, painful process that's being avoided at the root of it. How does that land? Does that make sense of what you're saying? The deep thing, Nikki, is that there's hardly anybody who can do this work. Mm-hmm. We're trying to do something that's the equivalent of brain surgery, and it's really difficult. And most people are trained in one particular therapy or one particular tradition of breath work. But in order to do this, to really do justice to the depth of it, you need to bring all of these things together. And there just aren't many people who can do it. So we're all insufficiently trained. You know, all of you. You are all insufficiently trained. Because we're trying to do something very, very demanding and difficult and also very powerful. It's true, it's desirably powerful, but we're not prepared. We're not sufficiently prepared. Bringing this together, bringing the spontaneity and the depth and the embodied depth of the breath work together with the sensitivity of the relationship is a very challenging thing to do. And most people have expertise in one department or the other department, but something powerful happens in the synergy when those two things come together. And that hardly anybody is sufficiently trained for that. That's why we're doing a weekend like that. That's why we probably have to do another 50 of them, because it's so difficult. Yes, I think that's a good summary. Yes, that typically is the case. People have their comfort zone. They do what they're good at. They do what they've been trained to do. But this is about stretching yourself way outside any comfort zone. What I'm hoping you will take away from this weekend is a curiosity and an interest and an inspiration for further exploration. Very few of you will come out of this weekend feeling confident about this impossible task. You're not going to get confident with it in one weekend. It takes 50 weekends. I don't know, maybe 30 if you're lucky. But, you know, it's going to be difficult. So you're not going to end up feeling confident. It's just more about getting a flavor of how uncommon this is and how far there is to go. And that's in a way that you could say that's a good thing. It's interesting because that means when people are complaining about therapy, about breath work, and you know all these promises out there, and everybody's trademarking things, and then people go there, and half the people think, "Oh, it doesn't do anything. What was that all about? You know, what did I pay the money for?" So that half of the people accurately reflects the fact that what's offered out there is not very integrative and is not very comprehensive, and is lacking things. And it has this, what Nikki was saying, it has that kind of the dogmatism of everybody's comfort zone in it. And the only way you can do this, if you really leave your comfort zone way behind and you're surfing in uncertainty and complexity. And what we can take from this is inspiration that if we can do that, if we can bring these very rarely integrated traditions together, some incredibly powerful synergy can happen. So I'm hoping that you will feel inspired by your incompetence rather than disenchanted. So I'll do a demonstration. We'll get together in a group of 6 to make a bit of contact in the morning. Then we'll do the demonstration. So please think about whether you want to be the volunteer. It'll be an exciting ride, terrifying and exciting at the same time. And then we will draw out of that a more specific formulation of some of the principles that we juggle. And then we need to go back into the groups of 6 and have another go at the same thing. Basically, we use today's experience and what happened and what didn't happen to have another go. Like two more people will probably want to do the same exercise, but by that time you will have the benefit of the demonstration, and there should be more of a shared understanding what we mean by pushing the breathing. And then who do you become? What kind of ghost do you become when you do that? And you do that then more consciously, because to become that kind of ghost is deeply uncomfortable. And that's what Nikki, I think, meant about the conflict arose in the group about, trying to do something really difficult beyond your comfort zone, whilst at the same time trying to stick to your comfort zone. So that's going to be a bit of an ambivalent affair, so